The story begins with a black silhouette wandering through snowy streets during a snowfall. Going at such a time, given the terrible weather and lack of warm clothing, was certainly not the best decision. That is why the girl soon fell to the ground as all her strength left her. Lying on the ground and breathing more slowly over and over again, the girl realized that her body was simply no longer obeying her. Trying to hold on with all her might, she asked herself, was she really going to die such a miserable death? But what led to all this? The action takes us back a few hours to the estate of Count Brienne. Someone addressed Estelle Brienne. Al dente Brienne looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was thinking about and how long she was going to embarrass them. He simply couldn't believe that she would go out in public like that. He hoped that she didn't want rumors to start that Miss Brienne was spreading the white disease. White disease, or so-called albinism, belonged to Estelle. It is a hereditary disease, a complete or almost complete absence of the pigment, melanin, or chlorophyll. The man, meanwhile, continued to say that everyone would whisper that this was a terrible disease in which everything dyed white, as if it had turned gray. Al dente even said that he was simply ashamed to show his face to society. He wanted to say something else, but at that moment, the butler addressed the count. Looking at the man, he said that they had a special guest. Al dente, of course, did not understand who he was talking about. Soon, a woman appeared at the door, bowed down, and asked forgiveness for coming unannounced. The girl wanted to say what she had to tell them. The butler, however, tried to stop her. L'Aurelia Brienne looked at the butler in confusion and asked what was going on. The man began to ask the lady for forgiveness and say that he would now explain everything. At this point, the guest interrupted him, and looking at Al dente and L'Aurelia, she said that she was their real daughter. Our heroine almost fell over at that moment from what she heard. She didn't hear it right, did she? The girl, meanwhile, continued to say that when she was a baby, the nannies mistakenly confused her with another child. Al dente jumped up from the sofa and started saying that this was complete nonsense, so he asked the butler to send this crazy girl away. Only the butler sighed heavily and, lowering his head, said that a strange situation was emerging. He asked to look more closely at the color of the girl's eyes and hair. He must make them understand that this is true. Noticing these details, the man really fell into a stupor because he understood that this changed everything. The girl continued to assure Al dente that she really was from the Count's family. Miss L'Aurelia turned at once to the butler and asked if that was all he wanted to tell her. The man nodded his head at once and brought a letter of guarantee from the wizard on a tray, which confirmed the lady's words. She really is his own child. Al dente glanced over the entire document and soon after stared at the girl in bewilderment, asking if it was really true. The girl sighed heavily and, turning her head away, said that everything was so. Soon after this, she turned her head and almost screamed and began to say that she had been exchanged with this girl, the maid's daughter. Well, in the end, as soon as our heroine heard all this, a forgotten memory came flooding back to her. To be more precise, she remembered the fact that she was in a novel that she had read in her past life. This is the story of Cinderella Countess Syria Brienne, whose fate changed dramatically with the arrival of a beggar woman. Of course, the whole role of our heroine in this novel is that this is just a director's device to describe the poor past of the main character of Syria. While Al dente Brienne looked with disdain at his adopted daughter, L'Aurelia only exclaimed with delight. She immediately jumped up and ran towards Syria. Our heroine was watching her at that time. The woman began to say that she knew all this, that deep down she did not feel Estelle as her daughter, which of course hit our heroine. In any case, the woman welcomed her real daughter with open arms. Syria was no less happy to see her mother. Anyway, the woman hugged Syria and began to ask her for forgiveness for the fact that they did not know everything that happened. And again she looked at her daughter, saying that the threads of fate were too interesting a thing. Soon she turned around and looked at Estelle and said that this white ghost could not be a descendant of their family. She did not understand how they did not suspect anything. However, at that moment, Al dente approached our heroine. The girl looked up at her father in surprise, hoping to hear words of support, but the man only said that he hoped that she understood what would happen next. Our heroine refused to believe all this, so she asked them almost with tears in her eyes to stop talking like that. The man said that she need not worry, as several servants would accompany her because the Brienne family had honor. In any case, he said that once she left this house, they would become strangers to each other. Immediately after these words, he told her to return to her true place. Soon the conversation was over, and the words of the father, or rather now it is better to say Count al dente, were finished. The action takes us to a snowy street. At this time, a bunch of guys were standing around the bags talking about how incredibly cold it was outside, so why did it sound like a bolt from the blue? In any case, one of the guys looked at the girl and invited the lady to follow them. After this, he apologized, saying that now it was not really possible to call her a mistress. The women began to smile and say that she was only the daughter of a servant. However, they were curious about her father. What kind of mistress could this white ghost be? However, as always, before Estelle heard it now. In any case, they kept going straight. The woman at this point looked ahead in surprise and asked why the guest house was not visible. Meanwhile, our heroine tried to catch up with them, but unfortunately her legs simply did not move, and besides her head was spinning. The girl looked at her feet even though everything was swimming before her eyes. Could this also be because of the illness? Anyway, one of the women turned to the girl and asked her to be faster. Shortly after the girl's screams, her partner turned to her and asked why she was wasting her nerves. They just needed to think about who got them kicked out of the county. That's why the woman said how this all pissed her off, so she just leaves Estelle here and they should speed up. Instantly, they quickened their pace and their silhouettes began to smoothly disappear under the cover of snowfall. Our heroine followed them with all her might, but she simply could neither scream nor run. Soon, the action takes us to the evening, or rather to the events of the story from the beginning of the story. Estelle was already lying on the ground unconscious. Luckily for her, she was discovered by a stranger who was not indifferent to those who needed help. He looked at her frozen lips and was surprised that there was a person lying in such a place. Soon the guy sighed heavily, thinking that most likely she was already dead. However, immediately after such loud thoughts, he heard a heavy sigh, and again, despite what was happening, the guy simply ran up to her and picked her up in his arms. Looking into her eyes, she only said to herself that she was very lucky. She would have died soon, but luckily she had him. The guy immediately put his hand in his pocket and began diligently searching for something. Soon he took out a bottle with a luminous liquid and immediately opened the cork. He immediately moved on to the next step. The guy started drinking the contents of the vessel. Immediately, the guy leaned over the unconscious Estelle and kissed her. Looking into her still closed eyes, he said that after this, God would guide her. Raising his head and looking at the estate, the guy hoped that no one would object to his last act of kindness. In any case, he picked her up in his arms and headed towards the estate gates to bring the girl into the warmth. The action takes us to the palace, where a bewildered butler was running along the corridor. Running into the room, he turned to Mr. Alland, who looked at the man in just as much surprise. Either way, he was glad to see him, so he waved his hand happily and wished him good morning. The man greeted her back and said that he needed to tell her something about a situation that had happened the previous night. The boy asked in surprise what had happened, to which the butler replied that there was a man standing in front of the door right now. Soon Alland sighed, deciding that such an idol as his brother could only have brought his mistress. In any case, he decided to ask again if he understood correctly that last night a black-haired guy appeared and abandoned the girl in front of their house. He also asked the butler if he had accepted it. The man nodded his head twice. Alund appreciated this act, saying that he was a good man because the girl could have frozen to death. The butler was glad that the gentleman appreciated his actions and that he did not cause a panic. Anyway, Alund asked where the girl came from, to which the man smiled and said that he would find out everything himself now. Soon after these words, the door of the room slowly began to open, and inside it one could immediately see a bed on which their guest was lying. The guy immediately came closer to her to take a closer look, but he just opened his eyes wide in bewilderment. The butler sighed and told the gentleman that he was not imagining things. She really was suffering from white disease. Anyway, he leaned over her and started talking about how she had lost quite a bit of weight. He didn't understand how anyone could be that thin. At this time, the butler looked at Mr. Alland, realizing that the white disease was little known. So many people treated it as an infectious disease. The man hoped, and perhaps was even sure, that Alund knew about this girl's condition. Anyway, at that moment, the guy turned around and asked the butler what was wrong with the girl. The man replied that her temperature had dropped and the crisis was over. He also added that they could only wait for her to open her eyes. Alund nodded his head and asked to call more healers. The butler smiled, bowed before the master, and said that he would fulfill his request. After some time, our heroine, without even opening her eyes, began to feel warmth. Opening her eyes, she noticed a luxurious chandelier in front of her. She couldn't understand what was happening. Was she really dead? Having gathered her thoughts and strength, she nevertheless sat down on the edge of the sofa, but her head still gave her no peace. It hurt too much. Estelle raised her head and began to think about what happened and came to the conclusion that she definitely lost consciousness in that blizzard, but as she looked around the room, she realized that she had simply never seen such bright rooms in the county. However, just at that moment the door clicked. The girl immediately realized that someone was coming to see her. A moment later, she saw a red-haired guy in the passageway who was glad that she woke up. Our heroine jumped up in horror, asking him who he was and why she was in this room. However, the guy didn't say anything and just started to reach his hand towards her. Estelle froze in horror, thinking that he would definitely hit her. She narrowed her eyes, but at that moment Allund only put his hand on her head and then said that her fever had subsided. Our heroine stared at him in bewilderment, which also surprised Allund. What happened? Estelle at this time only continued to look at him in horror, realizing that he had touched her without disgust. Her mind immediately recalled the situations when Lorelia accidentally touched the girl, after which she began to scream in horror and ask for water to wash her hand. One way or another, she was pulled out of her thoughts by the guy who finally asked her what happened. Estelle assumed that this man did not yet know that she had white disease. At that moment, the maid approached the master and said that most likely the girl's body had not yet recovered. In this case, the guy looked at the guest in surprise and asked why she got out of bed. He immediately asked her to lie down on the bed and rest a little more. Estelle, with her trembling voice, managed to utter the question that was bothering her. "What is this place?" Allund looked at the girl in surprise and said that she was in his house. She began even more perplexed to ask where this house was. Allund laughed and said that now he understood. They were in the Duchy of Valois. Our heroine was very surprised because she knew little information about the Duchy of Valois. The Red Duke's family has protected the empire since the time of its founder. The name has been the idol of the people of the empire, and the red hair is the exclusive property of the Valois family. The guy smiled at that moment and said that he should have started with a greeting. He immediately said that his name was Allund Nord Valois and that he was the second son of the Valois family. Undoubtedly, hearing the words that the second son of the Valois family was standing in front of her, the girl was very surprised. Soon after, the guy looked at the girl and asked her name. Our heroine immediately froze. She understood that if Allund found out that she was the white ghost of the Brienne family, then he too might turn away from her. In any case, she decided that she couldn't lie to the savior of her life, so she said that her name was Estelle Brienne. However, at that moment, the girl bit her lip, realizing that she was no longer from the Brienne family. Either way, the girl still didn't see the reaction she was expecting. The guy just nodded and said he was pleased to meet her. He then said that until she got better, they would live under the same roof for a while. That's why he extended his hand to her to conclude the so-called contract. But the girl froze in bewilderment, not understanding whether she should take his hand. Allund looked at Estelle in surprise and asked if she was not going to shake his hand. The girl reminded him of her illness with a trembling voice. The guy asked her in surprise if she was afraid that he might catch a cold. Anyway, he said that he was in good health. The girl, although reluctantly, nevertheless extended her hand. Allund smiled at her and asked Mrs. Estelle Brienne to take care of him. As a result, after this meeting, our heroine lived in the Duchy of Valois for several days. At this time, it was time for lunch. The maid brought the mistress today's dish, which was sea turtle soup. The girl assumed that she was already tired of eating only soups, but fortunately the doctor said that starting tomorrow she could eat at least whole grain bread. Our heroine looked at the maid and said that she was not tired of it at all. Even if she ate it for several days in a row, it was still delicious because it was the first time she had eaten such a delicious soup. The girl smiled, saying that it was a real relief for her that she liked the soup because the chef had been very worried. Estelle reached for her spoon at that moment, saying that the cook certainly had nothing to worry about, but she didn't notice that the other maid was reaching out to her to fix something, so their hands collided. The girl abruptly pulled her hand back, and our heroine just looked at her embarrassedly and apologized. In any case, the maid quickly grabbed a rag and began to rub her hand, which Estelle and the other maid stared at in bewilderment. The woman immediately asked Emma in bewilderment what kind of rude behavior this was. The girl bowed and began to apologize, saying that she had done it unconsciously. The maid said that excuses would not help here, so she told her to get out of here. She also said after Emma left that she would definitely have to take disciplinary measures. The woman immediately apologized to Ms. Estelle, saying that Emma had just started working there, so she had done such a rude thing, but she would train her. However, our heroine was already used to this, so she said that she was fine. Soon she began to pull a spoonful of the delicious soup to her mouth, and suddenly thought about it. Estelle understood that if it were not for these good people from the Duchy of Valois, she would really have died. Even if everything that was happening was caused by sympathy, it was the first time in her life that she had received so much care. The girl looked at her reflection in the cup and wondered, could she be happy? At that moment, her thoughts were interrupted by some strange and loud sounds from the street. Estelle immediately turned to Audrey and said that it was noisy outside today. Had something happened? The girl cried out in bewilderment, saying that she had completely forgotten to tell about it. The second Duke was returning home today. Audrey smiled and said that he might even arrive soon. Our heroine asked again in surprise. The maid smiled and asked the girl not to worry too much, because the second Duke was a very good man. Estelle smiled sheepishly, forcing a smile, and said that she understood. Still, she was uneasy. Although Alan had said that everything was fine, the second Duke might have other ideas. Perhaps she would be driven away again and she would wake up from a good dream. In any case, before she left, she would definitely like to thank Alan, but when would be the right time? By a fortunate coincidence, the girl just looking out of the window saw Mr. Alland on the street. The guy was telling his assistant something, but suddenly made a face in pain and grabbed his heart. Our heroine screamed in horror, saying that something had happened to Mr. Alland. Even Audrey, who was clearing the table, was frightened by this scream. The girl looked at Estelle in bewilderment and asked her what happened. Estelle turned to Audrey and told her that right before her eyes Mr. Alland had fallen. The maid was very surprised but still ran to the window to look at it. Looking out the window, she actually saw Alland, who had fallen to the ground. The girl realized in horror that this was a harbinger of the disease and it had appeared earlier than last time. If it starts, there will be chaos all around. Audrey immediately turned to the lady, starting to say that it was dangerous to be here, but where did Estelle go? At this time, our heroine was running headlong through the corridors of the Valois palace. Soon she finally ran to the exit and Audrey ran after her, asking the lady to stop. Our heroine looked at Mr. Alland and noticed that he was still writhing in pain. Was he really that bad? Audrey at this point approached the lady, saying that Estelle had run away too quickly for someone who had recently been ill. The girl was not listening to Audrey at this time because in her head there was a thought that she had previously seen the symptoms of what was happening to Alland only in others. When she was in the temple for treatment of the white disease, she saw the priests standing over one such man who was writhing in pain and twitching. Our heroine realized that Mr. Alland had overdone it, so she immediately ran to him. Audrey tried to stop the lady, saying that it was dangerous, but it was too late. At this time, Mr. Alland began to rise from the ground, already angry. There was an incredible amount of rage and aggression in his eyes. It was scary to imagine what filled his thoughts. Nevertheless, our heroine pounced on him and hugged him, telling him not to move. Immediately, the guy's eyes changed and regained their usual bright look. Estelle hugged Mr. Alland and told him that when he was overloaded, he needed to relax as much as possible without moving. However, the guy was leaning more and more on the girl, which Estelle, of course, started talking about because it was hard for her. As a result, her warnings did nothing to prevent them from simply falling to the ground. Just at that moment, someone approached the guys and stood right above them, which our heroine, of course, noticed. Another guy with red hair looked at the girl and asked if she was the guest of Alun's. After some time, the same guy stood in front of the window and thought about his own things, or rather about Estelle Brienne. The phoenix power in the Valois family's blood often caused severe overloads in the human body. It is a common chronic disease of the 4 great families, including the Valois, who are blessed by God, and even the church is unable to cure it. But at one point, everything calmed down when the girl simply hugged Alland and stopped him. With a heavy sigh, the gentleman decided that this was just a coincidence and that he was wasting his time thinking about it. However, just at that moment, someone knocked on his room door, so he turned his head. There was a guy standing on the threshold who was addressing Mr. Lloyd and saying that he needed to report about Mrs. Estelle. The man asked what he wanted to tell him, to which the guy said that a few days ago their maid had run into someone. He explained that he had encountered a maid from the Brienne family and had spoken to her, who had said that they had a new mistress a few days ago. Seeing the surprised face of the gentleman, the guy added that the only daughter who was originally in the family had disappeared, and now the new Saria would be officially entered into the family register. At this time, the action takes us to our heroine, who was lying on the bed and sighing heavily. She was afraid of the second Duke because she didn't think that he would appear so suddenly, and what's more, at that moment, she was certainly not in the best condition, considering that Mr. Alund had fallen on her. She was so surprised that she couldn't even say hello properly. She is a patient with white disease, and she behaved so rudely. The girl immediately thought about what would happen if she was evicted. How would she continue to live in the world of the novel? And what is the world of the novel? By the way, our heroine does not know how she died in her past life and how she was born as a character in the novel. In any case, she knew that the main character of this world was Saria Brienne. That's why she was treated so terribly in the county. She was like an outcast. However, something still bothered the girl, and it seemed rather strange to her. The family is so rich that they are not even afraid of the emperor. This is how the Brienne family was depicted in the novel. This thought came to her mind immediately after she tried to remember her past life. However, Brienne never seemed to have as many connections and wealth as in the novel. And if you think about it, Saria also looked like a passive character, so why did the content of the novel change? Just at that moment, Audrey knocked on the door and asked the lady if she could come in. Our heroine jumped up and said that she could come in. Entering the room, the girl assumed that Estelle had been very scared recently, so she wondered if she had gotten hurt somewhere. Estelle looked at the maid and told her that she was okay. Then she decided to ask if Mr. Alland was okay. Audrey smiled and said that Mr. Alland is currently resting, but there is still information. The maid looked at Estelle and asked if she knew that they were talking about her a lot. Our heroine asked again in surprise because she did not believe that they were talking for her. Audrey said that everything was correct and also said that thanks to her, she would also become popular. After all, it was the first time they had seen such an amazing sight. Estelle was certainly surprised and confused by this conversation. In any case, the maid turned to the girl and suggested that she go for a walk instead of talking about all this right now. The girl looked at Audrey in surprise and asked if she really could go for a walk. The maid smiled at her and said that she had been very frightened recently, so she needed to improve her mood. By the way, the master also allowed it. The girl at this point shyly squeezed her legs together and asked about Mr. Lloyd. Did he mind that she was here? Audrey was very surprised at first and soon after grabbed Estelle and told her that he was all for it because she was Mr. Allen's benefactor. The girl asked Estelle not to say that and not to think about it. Our heroine in turn stared in surprise at Audrey holding her hand. In any case, after some time, the girl tried on a cape that she could go out in. She felt very warm in this cape. Audrey clapped happily, saying that Miss Sibeli had worn the cape, so she thought it would be perfect for her. While the maid was suggesting that they go for a walk, our heroine wondered who Mrs. Sibeli was. She decided that she would ask that next time. After some time, the action moves to the beautiful garden of the Duchy of Valois. The girls walked along the path and our heroine shook her head and said that it was very beautiful here. Audrey said that magic was at work here to maintain warm weather. This means that the garden is full of flowers all year round. Anyway, at that moment, they noticed a gazebo in front of them. The maid smiled and looked at Estelle and asked if she would like to enjoy tea in the gazebo since the day was so warm. In any case, our heroine didn't even have time to say anything when suddenly Audrey ran, saying that she would prepare everything and she could rest. Estelle ended up alone, and despite asking Audrey to stop, she still left her. Soon the girl nevertheless headed to the gazebo to wait for the maid to arrive. When she went inside, to her surprise, she noticed a blonde guy inside. The guy turned around and, noticing the stranger in the same way, decided to ask who she was. Our heroine stared at him in bewilderment, wondering, was there really an angel standing before her? While she was looking at him without taking her eyes off him, the guy approached her and asked who she was. Luckily, at that moment, Audrey arrived, who was also surprised to see him there. She asked Duke Enard how he was doing. Then she started asking when he came back because he literally didn't say anything. The guy sighed and said that it was his house, so it wasn't necessary. Our heroine at this point bowed and greeted the Duke, saying that she was very pleased to meet him. Enard looked at the girl in surprise. He immediately asked in surprise if this was a new maid, and Audrey was training her, but the girl immediately screamed and said that this was not so. She waved her hand and then asked Mr. Enard if he had heard the rumors about Mr. Alland. If he did hear, then the main character of those very rumors here is Mrs. Estelle. Enard looked at the girl in surprise and asked what she was doing with her body since she was literally skin and bones. Audrey, perplexed, shouted at the Duke. The guy still asked Estelle if she had eaten at all during her entire stay at the estate because she looked very weak. Audrey continued to ask the Duke to shut up. Soon after, she turned to the upset Estelle and began to calm her down. However, at that moment, another joyful voice was heard greeting Estelle. It was Alund who had come to his senses. Our heroine was very happy that he had finally recovered, but Enard was surprised for some reason. However, as she approached him closer, she saw his tired look, so she asked if he should rest a little more. The guy smiled and said that he was okay because usually his family beat him until he lost consciousness, but this time they didn't. Estelle, having heard about this method of suppressing this disease, was of course very surprised. Anyway, Mr. Alland thanked the girl for calming him down, but it was still dangerous. He asked her to stay away from him next time. Our heroine, in turn, said that everything was fine because if it helped, then everything was fine. He also saved her life. Enard, meanwhile, looked at his brother and couldn't really understand why Alland was smiling like that. Anyway, at that moment the guy turned to Estelle and said that a guest from the temple had come to see her. Our heroine nodded her head in surprise and then said that she would like to thank him. She is very grateful that they are so kind to her, but still her disease is incurable. She visited many doctors, but they all said that this disease cannot be cured. However, Alland reassured her, saying that nothing in the world is impossible, so she should calm down. Our heroine was still skeptical about all this, but decided to agree to the mercy of Mr. Alund. Soon the action takes us to the palace, where the priest examined Estelle and said that her white disease had progressed significantly. Mr. Alland looked angrily at the priest and asked who didn't know this. However, our heroine looked down and asked how much time she had left. This question upset the dukes and Lord Alland a little, because they did not want her to think about such things. In any case, the priest looked at the girl and said that she probably had about 3 years left. After that, he turned his head and noticed an incredibly angry Alund, so he immediately said that she might even have 10 years left. Lloyd sighed heavily and said that life extension is not a happy word. The guy said that he can risk his life to extend it for 10 years, but his abilities are limited. Mr. Alund immediately after these words approached Estelle and asked him who could help them in this situation. The guy spread his arms out to the sides and said that most likely the chief priest should be able to handle this task. Alland said happily that it was good. He looked at his brother and asked if he had heard everything. Lloyd nodded his head. However, at this point, the priest decided to interrupt their conversation and said that, with all due respect, the head priest does not go out into the street if there is no trust. Alund scratched his head, saying that the sick Estelle simply wouldn't be able to reach the temple, so there was nothing to be done about it. He immediately came up with a brilliant idea and suggested donating a lot of money to the priest and thereby forcing him to come. Enard assumed that his brother had gone mad. However, to his surprise, he also heard that Lloyd also agreed that it was a good idea. The priest was probably the most shocked of all because he had not heard such absurd ideas for a long time. Looking at the girl, he wondered, who was she anyway if even dukes would do such stupid things and think? Soon, the action takes us to the office of the second duke. Enard asked his brother what was the matter. Why did he do a job that he should not have done? Lloyd said it was an order, to which Enard replied that he had cut off the heads of 3 and left them in the warehouse. The duke merely shrugged and said that Enard had done a good job. The guy scratched his head in bewilderment and said that he understood a lot, but still, why should they help this guest? They even called the high priest. Enard had no idea that Lloyd liked to help people. However, the guy responded to this by saying that he saw how she helped Alland. The guy looked at his brother in surprise, and Lloyd said that this was not magic or any other power. For some reason, Alland doesn't come to and just sleeps. Enard asks if it's because of the guest. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Lloyd said he didn't think it was a coincidence, as Alund was taking the G's very hard. In turn, the guest did not harm him in any way, and the service he rendered paid off. Enard nodded his head and said so be it, but he still wondered why their brother was in such a strange state. Lloyd said that, as others say, when Madame Estelle touched him, the pain went away. Looking at Enard, he assumed that his brother knew what pain was from overload. Enard asked Lloyd in surprise what he was getting at. The boy said that he wanted to leave Madame Estelle in the duchy until she was fully recovered. By the way, he also added that he had already told his father about this and he was going home. Enard asked in surprise if his father was really coming home. Lloyd nodded his head and told his brother that father would arrive tomorrow. Enard sighed and said that he understood. Soon he turned around and headed towards the exit, saying that the mansion would now be noisy due to the renovation. Immediately, Lloyd turned his gaze to the table and glanced at the folder with the letter. The action takes us back some time when the Count was informed that Archduke Karlstein had arrived in the capital. The man asked where they got this information from. Assistant Lloyd said that the Karanka Guild itself informed him about this. The boy immediately began to think, because it had been 5 years since Archduke Karlstein had been seen in the Grand Duchy. What was he planning? Among the 4 families that have long protected the continent, the Grand Duchy of Karlstein has the blood of the most divine beast. Their power was certainly enormous, but the one who suffered most from this blood was Archduke Karlstein. Because of this, the family rarely traveled outside the duchy. Well, of course, the current Duke, Claude Karlstein, was no exception to the rule. Once again, Lloyd looked closely at the letter which said that the Archduke was in the village. What was coming? At this time, the action takes us to our heroine, who was looking at a green tree in surprise, thinking that a few days ago there was a blizzard, because of which nothing could be seen. Anyway, luckily she was in the Duke's mansion. But where would she earn a living when she left the mansion? As she began to think about what she was doing best, she realized that she was good at embroidery. The reason for this was that people avoided her, and that was why she sat in the room and embroidered. She was glad that she could at least do something, but it was a pity that she didn't remember most of the novel. At that moment, loud screams began to be heard from behind. The girl, of course, wondered where this noise was coming from and what it was caused by. Meanwhile, in front of the gates of the Valois estate stood butlers and maids who greeted the master. Clement Valois, who is the Duke, just stepped out of the carriage. The man looked at the butler Huron and told him that it had been 6 months. It had been a long time since they had seen each other. The man smiled and said that he hoped that the master had arrived safely. After Huron to Mr. Clement, and in the case of Alan Lloyd and Enard, they approached their father and said that they were glad to have their father back. The man greeted them and then said he hoped they had not overdone their training. However, even more attention than the sons was attracted by the unfamiliar girl standing behind them. Estelle approached the Duke and greeted him, saying that she was pleased to meet him. She introduced herself anyway and said that she was a guest and was staying at the Duke's mansion. The man said that he had heard about it, so he assumed that she had been there for about 3 days. Soon, Clement decided to ask the girl how she lost consciousness, believing that there had been a severe cold snap a few days ago. Our heroine sighed heavily and said that the man she called her father had kicked her out of the house. The man asked in surprise if he understood correctly that it was her own father who did this to her. Why? At that moment, the boys turned their heads away and only Alan asked his father to be less insistent. Anyway, Estelle said that everything was fine. As it turned out, her real mother is a maid, but who her father is already unknown. They said that at birth she was confused with the real daughter of Count Brienne. But now that makes no sense, because they probably already think that she is dead. Then she smiled and said that she was happy that in this mansion they didn't treat her like a ghost. The girl looked around at all the butlers and maids and then said that their kindness made her very happy. Either way, she's getting the point across that even if she has to leave this place, she certainly doesn't want to be the ghost of the Brienne family. Clement asked again if he remembered correctly that her name was Estelle. Everything else simply did not matter because she was still a small and fragile child. He explained to her that since she was born into an aristocratic family, she was not suited to work. She also said that her parents had kicked her out, which meant that she had no money. The man also said that she was probably having a hard time because of what had happened, so he turned to Madame Estelle and asked, "What about living in the Duchy of Valois?" The sons of Clement Valois cried out in bewilderment, asking what he was talking about, and our heroine, even more surprised, asked if he had accidentally mixed up anything. The man said he was absolutely serious. She could live in the mansion as long as she wanted. He was doing her a free service. Looking at the girl, he realized that she was using her body to ease Alan's pain. Just think an ordinary maid's daughter. Our heroine, meanwhile, still began to say that she was grateful to the Duke for the offer, but the man immediately interrupted her and asked if she really thought he was doing this out of pity. It was even absurd. Looking at Estelle, Mr. Clement said that he was doing this because he needed her. At this point, Enard clapped his hands and told his father that he knew how impulsive he was, but when they talked about it, he said he would be on his side. However, the man looked at Mrs. Estelle and said that it was just a suggestion, and he was not putting any pressure on her so she could take her time with her answer. He also apologized to the girl if she felt that he was burdening her. Estelle nodded her head and said that everything was fine. She agreed. Clement smiled and looked at her and said that they welcomed her to Valois. He also said after that they would take care of her. Our heroine smiled and said that she really hoped so. The action shifts to a few days later. Audrey was getting our heroine in order and talking about the Duke not being able to join her for dinner. Our heroine just laughed. She knew she didn't have to worry about him bringing up the subject of custody again. However, soon after this, she began to descend the stairs to go to dinner. Looking around, she realized that although she was here before, she was delighted every time the Brienne mansion certainly did not compare to this one. In any case, the girl went down the steps and headed to the dining room. She was already very hungry. However, she started walking so fast that she simply forgot that she had a long dress, so she tripped. The girl thought that she would not avoid falling, but at that moment Lloyd grabbed her and asked if she was okay. Our heroine immediately jumped up and stepped aside, screaming in bewilderment. The girl sheepishly began to apologize and say that she was fine and that she was grateful that he caught her. The guy, however, just looked at her in surprise and nodded his head as if lost. He then looked down at his hand and soon put it to his head because he knew that his headache had gone away in the blink of an eye. One way or another, together, they headed towards the dining room, where the maids stood waiting for them. The boys went inside and noticed a happy Alund waving at them, and a less happy Enard waiting for dinner. Seeing the girl, he said in surprise that he didn't even know that a guest would come to dinner. Our heroine wanted to say something, but the guy asked her not to stand there like a pillar and sits down at the table. He's hungry! Estelle was very surprised by this because she was thinking of saying that she could leave. Isn't he afraid? Anyway, the guy told her that in front of her father she was brave and said what she wanted. Then why did she become so modest? The girl realized at that very moment that she had been looking straight into the Duke's eyes all this time. However, at that moment, Alan approached her and told her that she had received a package. Our heroine looked at him in surprise, asking if he had made a mistake. Was the parcel really for her? The guy said he thought his father had sent it, but they said the sender's name was not listed. The maid put the box on the table and our heroine wondered who it could be. Anyway, she came up to the table and said that she was more than sure that it was not someone from the Brienne family. At this point, Mr. Lloyd interrupted the girl, asking her if he could step away with her for a minute. The man soon apologized to Mrs. Estelle for calling her so suddenly. The girl said that everything was fine, but asked what had happened. The guy smiled and asked if she could open the package first. The girl looked down in embarrassment and said that she was going to do it because she was also interested in what was there. A moment later, they both approached the box and opened it. Our heroine's eyes widened in surprise. Inside was a letter and several strange boxes, but the symbols on them. Judging by Mr. Lloyd's face, he knew who it belonged to, so his face was more shocked. Nevertheless, our heroine took one of the boxes and decided to open it. As it turned out, inside this small box, there was a diamond ring. Audrey immediately approached in bewilderment and asked if this shining miracle was really a diamond. Our heroine said in surprise that she herself did not know. While the woman was saying that it was beautiful and wondering who had sent it, Lloyd was still looking at the coat of arms and was confused. At that moment, the girl looked into the box and noticed a letter there that could reveal at least some truth. It made sense because if it was a letter, it should say who sent it, so Estelle immediately started unpacking it. The stranger wrote that he had finally found her and asked for forgiveness. In any case, the enclosed items were hers. He told his niece that she had not seen him, but it was a matter of time. Our heroine immediately froze niece. Audrey suddenly asked the lady if everything was okay. The girl decided to open the box that was in the parcel and find out what was inside when suddenly a brightly glowing stone flew out of it. The stone was so bright that it instantly blinded the girl and also shocked her. The girl bowed back and Lloyd grabbed her. After this, Lloyd looked at Estelle's eyes in bewilderment and said that something had happened to them. He immediately asked the maid to bring a mirror, and a moment later, the girl was standing with it in her hands. Our heroine nevertheless came up to look at herself, and her surprise knew no bounds. She wanted to know what it was when suddenly the Duke said that it was all because of the dragon's tear stone. Immediately, Lloyd looked at Estelle and asked her to listen to him carefully. Many years ago, when the earth was completely destroyed, 4 godlike beings blessed the people. Among them was a family blessed by the phoenix. Of course, we are talking about Valois. Also following them was a family blessed by a griffin. We are talking about the Archduke Karlstein. He had a connection with the current imperial dragon, but the latter should be of more interest to her. There was a family blessed with unicorns, and he is now talking about the Mercedes family. This family had the same power as the imperial family, but was executed for treason overnight. But despite its sad fate, the long-standing popularity of the Mercedes family was not easily dispelled. Eventually, after the death of the Mad Emperor, the current emperor admitted that the verdict of treason was wrong. He apologized and restored the honor of the Mercedes family, but there was no Mercedes family left to accept the apology. The holy relic, Dragon's Tears, is a utopia for godlike beings, and it was the ideal for tamers. Every now and then in the Mercedes family tree there appears someone who can respond to the dragon's tears. At this point, Entangled interrupted his brother and asked him to be brief. If he understood correctly, then Estelle, whom they thought was the mistress of the Brienne family, was actually the daughter of a maid, but upon examination it turned out that her mother was a descendant of the Mercedes family? Our heroine was even more perplexed after this news. How could the author of the novel have thought of such a thing? At this point, Clement asked if it was true that the letter said, "To my niece." The man looked at the girl and said that it only meant that she was still alive. Liana Mercedes is the last descendant of the Mercedes family, her aunt. He immediately warned everyone that if this became known, the entire continent would pay attention to her. Lloyd said that he agreed with his father's opinion, but there was no point in telling them because they would find out everything themselves. One way or another, Mr. Clement told our heroine that she had an extraordinary talent. All sorts of cunning gods will stick their heads out in front of her nose like sheep and even a dragon. However, Entangled said that it was not even that. Did she know how much people overloaded with divine blood suffered? One touch would tell her everything in a split second. His father asked him to put those thoughts aside as the priority at the moment was protecting Miss Estelle. After that, he looked at Lloyd and asked him to find out about the person who delivered the package. The guy nodded his head. Soon the action takes us to another place, or to be more precise, to the imperial castle of the Asteria Empire. In it, the first prince of the Asteria Empire, Joachim Astrid, asked in confusion whether the dragon had really gone berserk. The assistant lowered his head and said that the chain was almost broken due to the fire. The guy sat down on his chair and said that this was simply unthinkable because 10 years had already passed since the dragon took the pill and fell asleep. 10 years ago, he couldn't handle a captured baby dragon, so he decided to drug it every day. And it didn't matter how strong a creature he was because he couldn't wake up. So all this means is that he was in shock strong enough to overcome the effects of the drug. Now the only option is one Mercedes family heirloom, Dragon Tears. Records show that even when the dragon went berserk 100 years ago, there was a man in the Mercedes family who responded to this gem. When interacting with the dragon's tear, even dangerous gods can be dealt with. This was a great threat to the imperial family. The late emperor was scared and made the worst choice, and therefore, in Joachim's opinion, he is a fool. As expected, the Mercedes family could not be completely exterminated. Liana Mercedes is still alive, and he knows a few secrets, but it's still an obvious fact. If only she had a child. In any case, at that moment, a guy knocked on the door of the office and addressed His Highness. The man asked what had happened. The guy said that a person who is a member of the Karanka Guild wants to meet with His Highness because he has information that might be of interest to him. Joachim asked what information was being discussed, to which the butler replied that as far as he understood it was related to the Mercedes family. The guy immediately grinned and asked to tell this man to come inside. Soon the action brings us to the Duchy of Valois. Lloyd was walking down the corridor, but at that moment he noticed something strange on the street. Looking out the window, he noticed a strange guy below who had arrived in a carriage. The boy asked the Duchy of Valois to accept the order of His Highness the Crown Prince. Lloyd immediately came up and asked the guy what order he was talking about. He began to read the words of His Highness the First Crown Prince Joachim Astrid as a loyal servant of the Asteria Empire. Lloyd immediately looked angrily at the guy and told him that his tongue seemed to be too long and he wanted to make it shorter. He asked to tell the essence of the visit. The guy immediately said that His Highness wanted the entire Valois family to attend the 5th Crown Prince's birthday celebration. Lloyd looked at the Emperor's servant Joachim in bewilderment and asked if he was really calling him. The guy, perplexed, said that this was not what was being discussed because it was an invitation. He explained that all aristocratic families were invited. Valois should not be left out. The guy turned his head and said that alienation is when the strong exclude the weak. He thinks that in this case it should be the other way around. Soon after, Lloyd and Ard also approached the guy, asking the guest dressed in imperial clothes if he understood correctly that he was the Crown Prince's man. The servant immediately tensed up, realizing that this man was also from the Valois family. In that case, he decided not to be rude, so he nodded his head. Ard at this point took out his dagger and said that in that case, he would have to tell what orders Joachim had given one by one, and without mistakes. During his entire stay in the Duchy of Valois, the guy had already regretted coming here several times. The action takes us to our heroine, who was knocking on Clement's door because she was invited here. The first thing Mr. Valois said was that the Crown Prince had most likely already noticed her existence. Our heroine asked again in bewilderment, and Lloyd told her that the prince would try to get her by any means and make her his puppet. The girl immediately asked if it was because of her blood relationship with the Mercedes family. Clement approached Estelle Mercedes and told her that she was more politically important than she thought. He explained that they could hide her from the Crown Prince, but the prince was as persistent as a snake and would try to find her with all his might. That is why the man suggested that she do something amazing and, on the contrary, perform confidently without hiding so as not to allow anyone to touch her. The girl's mind immediately recalled the past. Her family was always interrogating her, asking how long she would continue to disgrace them. She was humiliated for everything. Hiding was her daily life, but did she want to live hidden? Or would it be better to show herself? There was no such choice for her. At least up until this point, her hands were tied, as was her mouth, but now everything was different. She finally gave her answer. After a while, the action takes us to a hall where there was a whole bunch of aristocrats. The girl said that today it seems many wonderful people are gathering. One of the women said that this was quite logical since it was a banquet in honor of the Crown Prince's birthday. Meanwhile, Clement and our heroine stood outside the door while the butler asked them to wait a second. Soon the boy conveyed to the man the words that the last lady had finally arrived. At that very moment, they began to announce the arrival of His Excellency Duke Clément Valois, who was not alone that evening. People wondered who he had come with. However, a moment later, they were given an answer, because the guy then named the girl whose name was Estelle Mercedes. People, as soon as they heard the name Mercedes, were incredibly confused and immediately decided that most likely her name was pronounced incorrectly. Anyway, Clement was walking down the stairs holding Estelle's hand and suddenly asked if she was nervous. The girl turned her head and looked at the Duke and said that she was fine. The man smiled back at her and said that was good. She should continue to act casually. Estelle nodded her head. She knew that if she hadn't been ready for this, she wouldn't have come. At that very moment, our heroine began to look around the crowd with her eyes, and among them there was one person who looked as if into the soul. Taking a closer look, the girl noticed the gaze of that very Syria Brienne, because of whom she was kicked out of the estate. One way or another, at that moment, Clement approached her and invited the girl to dance with him. Our heroine smiled and said that she was all for it because it was an honor for her. By the way, the man said that he would have invited another, but unfortunately everyone was already taken. In any case, after a while, they were already spinning in a dance, looking into each other's eyes. Estelle at that moment even thought that all this was like a dream. Right now, she is at a luxurious ball. By the way, Brienne's family could never afford such a thing, so she never attended such events. In any case, after a while, the girl could barely move her legs because, as expected, dancing is difficult for her. At that moment, the Duke of Valois approached the girl, saying that he had brought a drink. Our heroine thanked him. Soon he looked around and said that all the people were looking at her and seemed to want to meet her. However, as it seemed to our heroine, all the people were more interested in the Duke than in her. Anyway, At that very moment, they were distracted by the butler who turned and ran towards Mr. Valois. The guy ran up to Mr. Clement and started whispering some information into his ear. The man just listened and nodded his head. Soon after, he told Lady Estelle that he had to go away for a while, but she need not be afraid, for he would not be far away. Our heroine said that all was well. Watching the boys leave, she sipped wine and assured herself that she was not afraid. As a result, not even a minute had passed when, at the same moment after Mr. Valois left, someone approached our heroine. The girl turned her head and noticed aristocrats in front of her. The girl with red hair was called Elodie Robert. She said that she was pleased to meet her. Our heroine placed the wine on the table, after which she smiled and greeted Miss Elodie. The girl immediately approached Estelle and said that her hair was too amazing. It struck her as soon as she entered the hall. One way or another, the girls continued to communicate with each other, but these were not all the new acquaintances. At this moment, a woman approached our heroine and asked her in surprise if she really was a descendant of the Mercedes family, the daughter of Liana. Our heroine looked at the unfamiliar woman with embarrassment and said that she was her aunt. The woman corrected herself, saying that everything was correct. It seemed that the blood genes were preserved. The woman then apologized for not introducing herself. Her name is Maria Stillyon, and she was Liana's godmother. Maria said with sorrow in her soul that she was talking to a girl on the day it happened. If only she had noticed everything in time and hidden the child. Our heroine immediately assumed that the woman was talking about the incident when the imperial family accused Mercedes of treason. Estelle hung her head because she felt sorry for Maria, who still felt guilty about everything that happened. However, the girl turned to Maria and thanked her for still remembering her mother. Estelle assured her that if her aunt were alive, she would certainly be grateful to her. By the way, our heroine doesn't even know what she looks like, but for some reason she's sure that she would have done the same. Maria smiled and took our heroine by the hands, telling her that she was grateful to her for these words. Liana was a very kind woman. Soon after, she raised her head and said that she had failed to protect her, but she promised her in the name of the Marquise of Stilljon that she would always protect Estelle. Our heroine smiled at the woman and said that her oath was a great generosity for her. Anyway, she said that she would like to get to know her better. The woman said that they would have time for that later. As a result, the action takes us some time ahead. After Maria left, everyone started approaching her. Moreover, our heroine even began to think that the Duke had left not on business but on purpose. In any case, the girl decided that social life was not for her at all. Just then, a stranger approached her. Raising her head, Estelle realized that not just one stranger had approached, but two at once. The guys introduced themselves as ambassadors of Duke Karlstein, and they were accompanying Arya Karlstein. Our heroine immediately stood up from her seat and greeted the ambassadors. As for Karlstein, she seemed to have heard of them somewhere. At that moment, the guys turned to her and asked if they could talk to her alone. Estelle asked if they really wanted to talk to her. The guy nodded his head and said it wouldn't take long, but it was important. Perhaps the girl felt something strange, but she still agreed to talk, and after a while they were standing on the balcony. The guys, finding themselves alone, immediately turned to Miss Mercedes and said that they were here to clarify something. Looking at the girl's eyes, they asked in bewilderment what had happened to them. Why were they so bright? Our heroine turned away in surprise, and the guys apologized for asking so directly. One way or another, if she reacted like that, it only meant one thing. Soon they bowed and said that the Duke wanted to meet her. The girl, perplexed, asked if the Duke himself really wanted to meet her, to which the ambassadors replied that everything was exactly so. Duke Karlstein needed her help. Our heroine asked to give her a second, and soon she thought about it. Only now did she remember one important detail. Archduke Karlstein was the main character in this world and was involved with Lady Saria. The girl suddenly asked if she understood correctly that the guys meant Claude Karlstein. The guys said that everything was correct. In that case, the girl asked the next question. She was curious why he needed her. The guy said he couldn't tell her the details because Duke Karlstein. Unfortunately, the guy couldn't finish because at that very moment the curtains on the balcony were open. It was Saria. The boys looked at her in bewilderment, and the girl apologized and said that she wanted to talk to Miss Estelle, but she didn't think that she was not alone. The guy turned to the lady with embarrassment and asked for forgiveness, but he and Miss Mercedes still had a very important conversation. The girl immediately exclaimed in surprise, saying that she was no longer going to be Estelle Brienne, but Estelle Mercedes. Syria smiled widely, looking into our heroine's eyes, and said that she certainly didn't expect to see her at the ball. Moreover, the girl said that she became worried because she did not see her in the mansion. These words surprised our heroine very much. Looking into Syria's eyes, she just had the feeling that she knew everything. Anyway, at this point, one of the ambassadors turned to Lady Syria and told her that this was too rude. Lady Brienne looked at the guy in bewilderment and asked if he really wanted to insult her. He immediately said that he didn't mean it at all. It soon turned out that these were not all the guests on this balcony. Clement also came out into the fresh air and finally found Estelle. He told all the people that they were taking up too much of his charge's time. The guys immediately apologized to Miss Mercedes and said that they would meet again later. Soon the ambassadors began to walk back inside, but Syria stood still. Clement looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to say something. The girl snorted and headed inside, but at the end she casually said that this pathetic girl was only a secondary character. These words struck our heroine like lightning. She immediately stared at Syria and could not understand what she had just said. However, the Duke approached her and asked why she was just standing there. The girl asked him to wait a little. Estelle immediately ran forward, thinking that she had definitely heard the words minor character. Clement did not understand what was going on, so he asked her to wait for him. The girl thought that Syria shouldn't have found out about this, so she tried to find her to talk, but where did she go? Although she didn't find Syria at that moment, our heroine heard a strange child's voice asking her to help him. The girl immediately headed towards the source of the sound, and to her surprise discovered that it was coming from the forest. In a moment she was outside, so she started turning her head to notice anything. And again, the voices appeared, asking for help. This quiet, childish voice came from the bushes right in the thick of the forest. The stranger said that if things continued like this, he would soon die. Our heroine was very surprised by these words. Without thinking twice, she decided that he had been kidnapped or worse. What was going on? Either way, Estelle was already running in the direction of the voice. Soon the voice became closer and closer, and eventually she reached her destination. In front of her she saw a wounded guy at whom the dragon looked and cried. Our heroine looked at the man in bewilderment and did not understand what he was doing in such a place. Moreover, even more surprising was the dragon begging for help and looking straight at the stranger. Our heroine suddenly seemed to come to her senses and immediately ran to the dragon, asking if she should call someone. However, this creature began to cry, saying that it is impossible to call a person. It is impossible for them to reveal themselves. Estelle looked at the man again in surprise and wondered, what did the words, "so that they wouldn't reveal it," mean? Just at that very moment, the guy woke up and began to cough heavily, writhing in pain. The girl touched him and realized that his body was simply burning. All this looks like symptoms of Alund overload. Looking at her hand, the girl decided that if she could use the ability she used on Alund, she could save this man. The girl nevertheless wondered how she could use this ability. At that moment, the dragon approached her and suggested that she could not save him. With tears in his eyes, the dragon asked if this man was really going to die. Estelle turned her gaze to the unconscious stranger and decided to herself that she would save him. She wanted to save him. She had to use her powers somehow, but she still had to figure out how. The action takes us back in time. Our heroine was watching Alund training and asking how to use a sword. The guy laughed and asked if she was really interested. He was still worried that she would be disappointed. He looked at her and said that there was no such thing as how. There was only an instinct for it. That is why the girl decided to act instinctively and soon hugged the stranger. Hugging him, the girl felt his hot body more and more, and it seemed as if she herself would burn herself now. In the same way, the girl understood that it would be very dangerous if the temperature rose even higher. That's why she asked all the godlike beings to help her. At that moment, a glow appeared. After only a few seconds, she felt movement, so she moved away from him. The dragon was hanging in the air, and happily asked if he had finally woken up. However, he still sat with his eyes closed and breathing heavily. Our heroine, to her regret, said that it didn't quite look like he was able to wake up. Soon she began to rise, saying that as expected she should call for help, but at that very moment the guy grabbed her hand. With his amber eyes, the guy began to look at his savior and try to say at least something. He could only utter 2 words before blood started pouring out of his mouth. The girl asked him in confusion if he was okay. The guy wiped his face and said he was more or less okay. The dragon immediately attacked the man, saying that he thought he would die. Our heroine understood for herself that the situation was urgent, so she helped him without hesitation. But still, if he lies with such a wound in the imperial palace, then it would be better for her not to interfere. At that moment, the guy looked at the lady and asked if he understood correctly that she had cured him. Our heroine, however, remained silent and looked at him as she began to analyze what she saw. Black hair and golden eyes, and he always has a dragon with him. Just then, the dragon said that everything was right. This girl made Claude better. The flying creature's words became final for Estelle's investigation. As expected, this is the main character in the world of the novel, Claude Karlstein. Our heroine knew she was a good person, but she seemed to have heard that for the sake of his status as a Grand Duke, he didn't care about good or bad. Overall, the girl understood that this should not have happened, and she would have stayed alive, thanks to the improvement of the main character. Anyway, Estelle did speak up. She told the guy that he looked much better now, and she was calm about it. The guy started talking and smiling again, but after he said that she shouldn't worry about him, blood started pouring out of his mouth again. In any case, he looked at the lady and decided to ask how she had healed him. The girl immediately realized that she could not say that she had used Mercedes's powers for healing. Karlstein is a family that has suffered from symptoms of overload for generations. Obviously, for the current Grand Duke, it would look like a good first aid kit, as it has the power of a Mercedes. They could just use it. Somehow she knew that Claude shouldn't notice that her words were lies. She said that she had learned to use calming magic, and it seemed to work. The dragon immediately turned to the owner and said that if this magic really worked on him, then before them stood a legendary tamer from the School of Magic. He immediately asked if she studied there. Estelle said that it was not so. She is not such an excellent wizard, and it is just a hobby. She studies as a hobby. Claude sighed and said that he understood her. Of course, there was a hint of distrust in his words. In any case, he said that he wanted to reward her, and the girl said that good deeds do not pay. The guy laughed, saying that she was being very stubborn in refusing his offer. After that, he took a step towards her and hovered over her. Soon, he finally addressed her. Our heroine nevertheless stared at his amber eyes, which seemed to look into her soul. At that very moment, the guy spoke to her and asked if she really didn't know who he was. After that, the girl smiled shyly and asked what he was talking about. Claude wanted to say something, but at that very moment, screams began to be heard from behind them. The crown prince turned to his servants and asked in bewilderment where this daughter was hiding. Our heroine looked at the crown prince and wondered, what happened? One way or another, the answer came from the one the prince was addressing. The man apologized to His Highness, saying that she could not leave the palace. As it turned out, this man was Aldente Brienne, who pointed out that the Valois family carriage was still here, which meant that the girl was somewhere in the palace. Our heroine looked at her father, or rather her adoptive father, in bewilderment and did not understand what he was talking about. At that moment, Claude turned to Frank. The dragon smiled and assumed that he wanted them to hide, so he was already using his magic. At that very moment, a strange glow appeared above them. Estelle raised her head and assumed that it was illusion magic. This was, of course, very interesting, but at this point, a question came from His Highnesses to Aldente. He asked if they had not raised her as their daughter for 15 years. He asked the Count to think twice, because how could his daughter have ended up at the ball? The man turned his head away in embarrassment and said he didn't know. However, Joachim thought to himself that he in turn knew, and most likely it was Aldente who had contributed to this. With a heavy sigh, the crown prince asked to try, because if everything goes well, he will become related to the royal family. The man immediately bowed and said that he would try. He would find his daughter Estelle. The crown prince looked at him with an incredibly crazy look and clarified that he had to meet her that very evening. A seriously frightened Aldente Brienne swallowed hard and said that he would find her that evening. Our heroine meanwhile realized in horror that this daughter was she, but why should they look for her? Moreover, from their conversation, she understood that her father said that he himself would go look for her. At that moment, the crown prince began to talk about sending a man to. He did not have time to finish as the butler interrupted His Highness. The man turned his head sharply and asked the servant who had just run up what had happened. The guy started stuttering right in front of the crown prince, so Joachim lost control and ordered him to quickly tell what happened. The butler lowered his head guiltily and said that their landmark or fifth egg had been stolen. At that very moment, the princes screamed at the top of their lungs because the fifth egg had the strongest defense of the group of guards, so who could get through them and take it? Our heroine immediately put the puzzle together, so she slowly turned her head towards Claude. At this time, the guys just like Estelle were following the conversation of the crown prince. The dragon snorted and said that it was funny because it was these people who stole the egg from them. He took his back and the prince says that it was stolen. Our heroine had already wondered what kind of enemies he might have met that left so many scars on him in the imperial palace. The girl turned her head again and decided that for her own safety, it would be better not to interfere. Meanwhile, the crown prince was furious. He ordered that everyone who was on duty today be summoned and punished severely. Joachim then ordered the entire palace to be searched because the thieves could not have gone far, and moreover, if the protection was removed, the thief would be in trouble. The soldiers shouted unanimously and said that they understood His Highness's words. After that, Joachim turned around and told the count that if he wanted to live, he had to pretend that nothing had happened. The guy knew for sure that he couldn't allow His Majesty to find out about the disappearance. Estelle at this point turned to the strangers and asked if she understood correctly that these guys were looking for them. Claude nodded his head and said that he was not going to deny it. In this case, our heroine decided to take an interest and asked what they would do. The guy smiled, saying that he thought the lady would be more decisive, but it seemed like she was a little worried. Estelle said outright that if they were caught, she would be accused of complicity. Claude thought about it and said that she was right. In any case, he asked her not to worry, saying that he would take her to a safe place. Our heroine was surprised that he wanted to do this right now when the crown prince's guards were searching everything so quickly. Where did he want to hide her? At that moment, the guy turned to the girl and asked if she wanted to go somewhere with him. The girl said she wanted to go to the ballroom. At that moment, a glow appeared around Claude. The guy nodded his head and said that there would be no problem with that. A moment later, he transformed and offered to go. Even the dragon was frightened and asked to warn him when he transformed. He soon apologized to the lady, assuming that he had greatly surprised her. Estelle didn't have time to really say anything, but she still extended her hand, and soon they began walking towards the banquet hall. However, while the boys were walking into the hall, they still encountered a knight on their way. The boy looked at the strangers walking in the forest and asked them to state their names. The boy looked at the guard and said that his name was Jean Lambert. The man immediately apologized and said that Baron Lambert could pass. He also wished them a good evening. Our heroine breathed a sigh of relief, but was a man named Jean Lambert famous? In any case, she was glad that they had an easy time. After some time, Jean, or rather Claude, took the girl to the banquet hall as he promised. The boy smiled at her, and soon he asked if he should take her inside. Estelle smiled and said that everything was fine. She just thought about it and hoped that Claude would get better when he had time. Anyway, at that moment, the guy approached the girl and said that if everything was okay, he would like to know the name of the lady standing in front of him. Smiling, he said that he wanted to know the name of his savior. Our heroine, of course, fell into a stupor and thought. The girl soon said that her name was Sibeli. Claude nodded his head and said that he understood her. Moreover, the guy smiled and said that he would remember Mrs. Sibeli, but our heroine only hoped that he would forget her. Soon after these words, Claude turned to his savior and said that although it was not entirely correct to say this, it would still be better if no one knew about their meeting. Our heroine nodded her head and said that she had guessed this herself. Soon there was silence, and then Claude told her that she was special. He found it strange that she did not ask for money or compensation. And again, the guy suggested that she didn't know who he was. The girl smiled shyly and turned her head away and said that she didn't know him. In that case, the guy bowed down and said that everything was fine. He didn't want to doubt his savior, but asked her to be attentive. He immediately turned around and left, and our heroine only thought that she was lucky that Claude did not find out that she was from the Mercedes family. The action, meanwhile, moves to the Valois brothers, who were very tense. Lloyd was confused and said that it was too late. Alan nodded his head and confirmed his brother's words. The guy asked if the ball was really going on that long since it was already well past midnight. Alan said that rumor had it that many dirty guys were trying to get hold of someone like Estelle. Alan said guiltily that he should have gone with her. Entangled suddenly turned to the brothers and asked how they knew how the ball was going, since they didn't even know how many there were. Alund cried out in bewilderment and told his brother that he had seen with his own eyes how many invitations there were to the ball. Entangled then sighed and said that even if that was the case, her father went with her, so there was nothing to worry about. At that very moment, the butler announced that the carriage had arrived, and Alund instantly jumped up from his seat to check if they had arrived. After some time, Clement and Estelle entered the building, having finally returned from the ball. Lloyd approached his father asking why they were late and how they spent their time with Mrs. Estelle. Our heroine immediately asked why they were not sleeping. Alund started smiling and asking how he could fall asleep if they hadn't returned yet. He was scolded for worrying. However, at that moment, the Duke of Valois looked at our heroine and said that it had not been easy for her today. Moreover, he would like to tell how she suddenly ran away from the balcony, but he will put it off for later. At that moment, Lloyd turned to them and said that he needed to go to the temple tomorrow. Our heroine looked at him in surprise and asked why to, which the guide told her that there was news. The guy answered her that he had heard rumors today that the high priest had arrived on the island. The action takes us to the next morning. At this time, our heroine was being tidied up by the maids. The girl thought that she was already exhausted in the morning because she was looking for an excuse for the Duke for what happened last night. Claude Karlstein. The girl understood that the meeting with this man was truly unexpected. She didn't think that something like this would happen when the main character and the main hero first met. She didn't even know she would be there. It seems like she met him before Syria because everything went wrong, but she probably won't meet him again, right? She also thought that even the Duke understood this, but she still didn't want to disturb these people. At that moment, Audrey turned to the girl and asked the lady if she was really that nervous. The girl said that Duke Entangled would go with her, so she shouldn't worry so much. Moreover, she said that Rhine, who is good at fencing, will also be by her side. Our heroine suddenly remembered that the Valois family had indeed called a priest. She thanked the maids. Audrey at this point assured the girl that this priest clearly had to say something different than the previous one. After these words, our heroine sighed heavily and lowered her gaze downwards. All sorts of obsessive thoughts immediately enveloped her. She didn't know if it would be easy to correct the fact that since childhood she had gone to the temple many times to treat the white disease. As a result, the girl was left unattended, never cured of her illness. In any case, the girl said that it would have been good if the priest had said something different and more important. After a while, the action takes us outside. As Audrey said, our heroine is accompanied by Entangled and Rhine. Meanwhile, the guy was thinking that everything was quiet, which meant that the news of the high priest's arrival had not yet spread. At that very moment, 3 priests approached them and greeted the Duke of Valois, as well as our heroine answered for herself instead of them and greeted the priests. The boys were surprised when they looked at her but asked her to follow them because the priest was already waiting for them. Soon, the priests led the guests inside the temple, in the middle of which stood the high priest. Without even turning his head, the man greeted Mrs. Mercedes and soon smiled and greeted the Duke of Valois as well. Looking at him, the girl understood that this was the very priest of the continent. The man at that moment approached her and decided that they needed to see what they had. The priest touched the girl's head and closed his eyes. The boy immediately felt that she must have suffered greatly, and he was very sorry. The girl said that when she was little, she often had fever, but now she is fine. However, our heroine understood for herself that the disease would only progress slowly, and that meant a quiet death. Anyway, the high priest smiled and asked the girl to follow him to lie down. Soon at the priest's request, the girl lay down while Entangled watched what was happening. At first, they thought that something had entered her, and watching the process made him worry about her. He was so worried that he was ready to pay a rather large price without even hesitating. The boy sighed and decided that this was why the second brother would hunt creatures on the western border for a while, as they say it was for Estelle. At that very moment, the high priest turned to the girl and said that he understood everything. He gave her his hand and said that the white disease largely divided progress into first, second, and third stages. Looking into the girl's eyes, he said that it was logical that the less progress, the easier the disease is to treat. However, the priest told Mrs. Estelle that she was currently in the third stage. The girl lowered her head and smiled softly, thinking that this was what she had expected. The priest suddenly asked her if she knew one detail about patients with white disease. The man said that they were being given a limited sentence, and if all went well, she had 3 years left. It didn't matter what kind of priest it was that was the limit. Enard immediately jumped up and asked the Holy Father what he was talking about. Did he really think they had come here to hear that? The guy looked at the girl angrily and said that it was time for them to go. He knew that the high priest had no special abilities. However, at that very moment, the priest looked at our heroine and told her that, with his power, it would be possible to heal her. Hearing these words, the girl seemed to see a ray of hope that she could become healthy. Estelle immediately started crying, and the man smiled and suggested that she start treatment tomorrow. The girl smiled through the cracks and told the Holy Father that she agreed. Enard, as soon as he saw Estelle's sincere smile, even smiled himself because he felt calmer in his soul. However, at that moment, the priest asked the girl in surprise whether she had ever met Archduke Karlstein. In an instant, Enard got angry again and asked why this man would want to see Estelle. Was it because Estelle had inherited Mercedes' blood? While our heroine sat like a mouse and said nothing, the priest said that everything was correct. The overload of Archduke Claude is probably the worst. However, Enard said that he would never allow this, and even more so, he would not let this guy near Estelle. Our heroine looked at Duke Enard in bewilderment and could not understand what was happening to him. The man sighed and said that there must be some kind of preface here, but at the moment he understood everything for himself. Shortly after he again brought up the subject of Miss Estelle's treatment, he asked that the fact that Estelle was being treated there be kept a secret from the Archduke. The guy said that recently he had also been treating Archduke Claude. Enard asked in confusion if this freak was really here too. The guy was incredibly angry, but he still turned around and told the girl that they needed to go. They needed to take countermeasures to keep the Archduke from hanging around here. Our heroine stood in her place in bewilderment and turned her head from side to side. The high priest smiled and said that they would see each other tomorrow. The guy came back for the girl, took her hand, and led her away. Estelle didn't understand what had happened to the Duke. As soon as they left the temple, the guy decided that first they needed to tell everything to their father. Our heroine suddenly decided that Karlstein's mission really was to find her. However, the Archduke will soon have a real cure, or to be more precise, Saria. At that very moment, the guy started walking, but at that moment, Enard stopped abruptly as he noticed a strange guy standing at the temple. He fixed his gaze on it and thought. Our heroine asked why he had stopped. At this time, Enard looked in that direction, thinking that he had already seen this face, and apparently it was a member of the Karanka Guild. The guy immediately turned to the girl and, ignoring her question, asked her to go home first. Rhine, at the Duke's request, immediately approached Madame Estelle, who was asking Enard in surprise where he was going. The guy smiled and said that he needed to stop somewhere on the way. He left soon after, and Rhine said that the Duke must have urgent business. In any case, she put on her hat and suggested that they go. However, the unexpected encounters did not end for today. Our heroine also froze in the blink of an eye. Rhine didn't understand what was going on, so she asked the lady what happened and then directed her gaze in approximately the same direction as she did. In front of her, she saw a group of aristocratic women who were talking to each other and laughing, but of course the girl would not have been surprised by the aristocrats just like that, because among them was Estelle's mother, Laurelia Brienne. Thus the aristocrats walked all the way to the end of the bridge and began to descend, not noticing anything around them. However, at that very moment, Laurelia suddenly froze in place. Her friend asked what had happened. The woman only cried out in bewilderment because she had noticed Estelle in front of her in exactly the same way. The aristocrats immediately began to whisper among themselves because they had heard a lot about Estelle. Our heroine decided to approach her mother, but she was wondering what she should call her. The girl came closer and soon greeted Count Brienne. The woman was perplexed. Laurelia asked again in bewilderment, trying to understand whether she had imagined it, and soon she even began to laugh. The woman looked at her adopted daughter with a crazy smile and asked if she really didn't even consider her a mother anymore. Meanwhile, people were watching what was happening in bewilderment. Laurelia was talking about it too loudly, so rumors were sure to happen. In any case, the woman turned around and said that when she first heard the news, she thought the world was going crazy. She looked at Estelle and told her to come clean. Lorelia wanted to know since when she knew she was going to be the heir. Moreover, she was incredibly angry that the girl did not thank them for raising her and was just waiting for the day when she could give them a slap on the back of the head. However, Rhine at that moment fenced off Mrs. Estelle and told the woman that she was too close. Lorelia was incredibly angry and even started waving her hand, asking how the maid dared to talk to her. At this point, our heroine screamed and told the woman to stop this circus. Estelle shielded Rhine with herself. The girl said that this was her man, so she had no right to touch him with a finger. Lorelia looked at her daughter in bewilderment and asked if she really dared to object to her now. The girl was not going to answer this question, so she grabbed Rhine by the hand, and having apologized, they went about their business. Finally, our heroine told her mother that she had nothing more to talk about with her. Soon the girl began to leave, but Lorelia was incredibly furious that her daughter did not even intend to stop. At this time, our heroine walked forward at a moderate pace and pulled Rhine behind her, who was addressing the lady. Estelle remembered the past in which Lorelia always yelled at her. Moreover, the woman told the girl not to even call her mother because it was disgusting. In the end, Rhine was able to bring our heroine to her senses and stop her. The girl pointed to her hand, saying that her hand was squeezing hers a little. Our heroine, perplexed, snatched her hand away and began to apologize for having taken her hand without permission. Rhine asked her not to be so surprised. Anyway, the girl apologized for calling her her person because she is a person of the Duchy of Valois. However, Rhine smiled and said that she is also her person. She accompanies her pop by the order of Master Enard. That's why, looking into her eyes, the maid asked Lady Estelle not to apologize. Our village sighed and thanked her for her kind words. Soon, the action takes us back to the palace. Almost the entire palace staff came to greet the lady, asking how she feels. What did the priest say? Rhine nevertheless kept her distance, and Audrey still tried to find out if they could help her. Our heroine laughed and said that the high priest promised to try to cure her. Anyway, he said he couldn't guarantee a full recovery, but he would at least try. Nevertheless, all the people ran to her saying that he would definitely cure her because there was no illness that a priest could not cope with. Audrey, with tears in her eyes, took the lady by the hand and said that it was a real relief for her. Our heroine was shocked that all the guys were so good. At that moment, one of the butlers said that it was necessary to quickly tell everything to the lord and master. The head butler smiled and said that he would pass everything on since the lady had no time for that right now. From this happy palace, the action takes us to the Brienne estate, where Al Dente hits the table, telling his wife that she is out of her mind. He asked how she could even think of raising her voice to Estelle in public. The woman said that she was the one who was talking to her so brazenly. Moreover, Lorelia said that their daughter did not even thank them for raising her. Al Dente sighed heavily, but soon sat down in his place. It turns out that they couldn't find her even at the ball, but as soon as she met her, she managed to humiliate Estelle in front of everyone. He started shouting again, saying that in order to apply for annulment of the family register, they had to prove that they were a peaceful family. However, the woman snorted and said that he was talking to her like that because he had not seen their daughter at the time. She was envious because the girl had shiny hair, lively eyes, and her clothes were very luxurious. The woman herself understood that if they had left this white ghost for a few more days, the Mercedes family would have belonged to them. Al Dente nevertheless said that they could grab hold of at least one thread, but now there is no other choice but to plead with the crown prince on this matter. At that moment, Saria turned to her father and asked him not to worry. It was best to leave everything as it was, and she would return Estelle back. The girl began to say, almost with tears in her eyes, that she also felt responsible for everything that had happened. She understood that the girl was kicked out because of her, because if she hadn't come exactly, then... Lorelia immediately told her daughter to shut up and not to talk nonsense, saying that everything was not so. Taking Saria's hands, she said that she was their true blood, so it couldn't be that a white ghost like her was their child. She knew that Estelle had planned all this, and that it was a clever trick. Saria should not feel any remorse in any case. While the father of the family watched the girls, Saria told her mother that she was grateful for her understanding, but they did not have to worry. The girl smiled and said that even if the middle had changed a little, the ending of the story should be the same. The action shifts to our heroine again. She was walking down the corridor with Audrey, who was reminding her that the treatment would begin tomorrow. Is the lady nervous? Our heroine said that this is why they are going for an evening walk. She can't sleep, so she is probably really worried. However, Audrey said that it was inevitable. In any case, all she had to do was get healthy. Estelle wanted to say something, but at that moment, she saw something in her peripheral vision, so she turned her head to look. In front of her, she saw a huge and luxurious portrait of Lady Sibeli, which was the size of the entire wall. Our heroine was fascinated by this portrait. Audrey approached her and suggested that she was seeing this portrait for the first time. The girl said that while she was in the temple, the portrait of Lady Sibeli was finished, so they hung it up. Estelle, confused, began to talk about that person, to which Audrey interrupted her and said that everything was correct. She is the youngest knight, Princess Sibeli. Now, the girl is trying to subdue the creatures on the border, but sometimes she returns to the duchy, so they will see each other soon. At this point, the girls finally came to the exit, and as soon as Audrey opened the door, our heroine was enveloped in a cold wind. The girl closed the door and said that it must be a little chilly at night. Even if it was warm during the day, the maid offered to bring her a shawl. Our heroine smiled at her and said that she would be grateful to her for that. It was probably after this that the maid went to get the shawl, and our heroine decided that she should wait inside until Audrey came back. At that very moment, the girl heard a strange voice. After listening closely, it became clear that it was someone's conversation. Coming closer, she heard that they were talking about the appearance of Archduke Claude in the city. Of course, the girl was surprised by this. Entangled was talking to his father at the time, saying that he had heard that Claude was hiding every time he had symptoms. Why on earth would he leave his lands and sneak into their capital? Our heroine, of course, noticed with the naked eye that, as in the case of the temple, Entangled, for some unknown reason, hates Claude so much. If she thought about it, she remembered that in the novel itself they were constantly arguing, and the quarrels were because of Sarai. At this point, Entangled decided to ask his father again what happened at the imperial ball. The man said he didn't know for sure, but he heard that the crown prince used a personal soldier to search the palace all day long. He also said that Mrs. Estelle was not involved in this, so there was no need to worry about her. However, our heroine, knowing the truth, was seriously scared at that moment. The girl understood that her conscience was beginning to torment her more and more, so she could not be here because eavesdropping was impolite. However, at this point, Entangled brought up the topic of tomorrow. He suggested that Estelle be given a strong guard so that the guy would never come near her. The man thought about it at that moment. The guy in turn explained that by reliable security he meant more than a dozen guards. He also said that one option might be that they could give her an artifact that she would carry with her at all times. Estelle was very tense because in such a peaceful place like this, even the queen did not have so many guards. Moreover, she was also interested in what artifact was just being discussed. In any case, at that very moment, a joyful Audrey began running towards our heroine, holding a shawl in her hands. Estelle turned around in horror and started waving her hands, signaling her to be quiet. The maid was very surprised by this and asked what had happened. The girl asked to go to the glass garden together, and there she would explain everything. Audrey smiled and said that at night it was especially beautiful. The action is transferred to the next day our heroine was waiting for today. She knew that she would start treatment very soon, which is why she was incredibly happy. However, at that moment she entered the dining room and the atmosphere here was far from cheerful. The guys were stunned by the news. Our heroine asked in surprise what had happened. The guy asked the Duke what to do, to which Lloyd said that he could show because it had already happened. The guy immediately approached our heroine and said that she needed to see this. Soon he handed her a newspaper. The girl looked at the headlines and was shocked. Estelle Mercedes, who overnight became the heiress of the most prestigious family. The newspaper told of her childhood when she was Estelle Brienne with the Count and Countess of Brienne. There was only one question. Did they know she wasn't their biological child? What kind of parents would live with such terrible doubts? Lorelia nevertheless admitted that they raised Estelle with love, but for a long time they thought there was something extraordinary about her. She explained that unlike them, her parents, the girl had grown up a beauty since childhood, and apparently she had learned the imperial language. Our heroine read every line with a shudder in her body, realizing that it was all a lie. Literally every word from the very beginning to the very end is a blatant lie. Entangled came up to them at that moment and asked in bewilderment what was written there. Snatching the newspaper, he said that he wanted to know too. The guy began to read carefully and run his eyes over the entire interview that the Brienne family gave. A moment later, he threw the newspaper away in bewilderment, asking what kind of absurdity this was. Why did they keep silent about abandoning the child? And this is called raising with love? Entangled was incredibly angry, but still turned to the girl and asked her to follow him. Logically, the girl decided to ask where they were going. The boy, in turn, said that it didn't matter to him whether it was the newspaper publishing house or the county of Brienne. He was going to go there and ask how they dared to ridicule his daughter in such articles. Our heroine was very grateful for these words, but she still understood that from that moment on, she was no longer in debt to the Valois family. However, at this point, Lloyd approached the girl and explained to her that these people were planning to sue. At that very moment, the newspaper fell out of the girl's hand because she was perplexed by what she had heard. What does the trial mean? Entangled immediately said that he had guessed that the Brienne family would dare to file a lawsuit. Estelle apologized, but still asked to speak more slowly and in more detail about what they were saying. What lawsuit are we talking about? Lloyd explained that the Empire has a law of family support. Does Estelle know about this law? The Family Support Act was passed to prevent children from carelessly abandoning their elderly parents. That is, if it is recognized that the parents cared for their child and raised him, then the child will not be able to stop communicating with his parents even as an adult. Our heroine screamed in bewilderment and asked if she really couldn't break off relations with them despite the fact that the Countess had been the first to reject her. Lloyd sighed and said that unless they could prove that they had failed to fulfill their parental responsibilities, our heroine herself understood that the Countess did not starve her. There were more cases when she ate incorrectly, but it was not enough to die. It was also true that she who had contracted white disease was raised in an attic. But just because they were able to provide food, clothing, and shelter, it doesn't mean they were able to fulfill their parental responsibilities. When her parents treated her so cruelly, the servants went even further, spitting and showering her with harsh words. The girl was also sure that these servants would give false testimony and she alone would simply not be able to prove her position. Entangled turned to the girl in bewilderment and asked why and what she was thinking about for so long. Her parents abandoned her in the middle of winter, and that says it all. Lloyd said the story was true, but does he really think they don't know it? The guy immediately realized that these people were trying to pretend that it didn't happen that night. Lloyd nodded and said that the truth was not so absolute. They could twist the facts as much as they wanted. Our heroine started to say something, but Lloyd interrupted her and said that she was saying everything correctly. Her parents decided to fight public opinion. If you impress people with a fake interview initially, it will be much easier to file fake appeals later. Estelle then decided that this article was just a foundation to plant her in front of fate. Lloyd sighed heavily once again and said that it was absolutely true. Our heroine thought about it, deciding that this was expected. She also suddenly realized what would have happened if they had detained her for a few more days. This way, her family would see that very package, and soon they would receive the dragon tears without any noise. At that very moment, Lloyd turned to the girl and asked if she remembered that his father had promised to sponsor her. The guy looking at her surprised eyes said that now there was no longer even talk of financial support. Entangled also said that they couldn't let her handle this alone. She needed to wait a little while. They would meet with the editor and see what the press could do. Lloyd asked his brother not to act so rashly because Estelle must decide for herself whether to accept help from Valois. Still looking at the lady, he said that he could guarantee that Valois could provide the necessary assistance. Entangled was thinking at the time that they could just tell her to wait a year until they could sort it out themselves. What was Lloyd beating around the bush for? Then he looked at the girl and wondered, what if she said right now that she didn't need help? Just at that moment, our heroine lowered her head and said that she was grateful to them for these words, but she needed a little time to think. Lloyd said he wouldn't put pressure on her, but he would still have to push her a little with the meal times. He explained his words and asked if today was the day of her treatment at the temple. Our heroine immediately ran to the table because, as they say, she can't wait for treatment, and especially on the first day, she couldn't be late. Lloyd, in turn, still looked at the words from the interview and was shocked that the Brienne family decided to write such a brazen lie. He knew that if this became known, the prestige of the Count and his wife would fall to the ground. Somehow it didn't seem like they didn't understand it. Did they do it out of sheer greed without any thought of defeat? Eventually he came to the conclusion that the Brienne family had an ace up their sleeve, so the guy called his assistant to him. Lloyd looked at the guy and reminded him that he had said something about Count Ravioli earlier. The assistant nodded his head and said that it was correct. Count Ravioli had owned Pavlodge for 2 generations. Lloyd nodded his head, and in that case asked to arrange a personal meeting for them. Meanwhile, our heroine was trying to eat. Ennard was pestering her and even now asking if she couldn't cut normally. The girl laughed and asked him to watch himself. One way or another, the action takes us to the city. Our heroine was sitting in a carriage, and the law on family support was constantly on her mind. She never thought her life would be so monotonous, but she never expected to be involved in a lawsuit. Anyway, right now the only thing she wanted was to find her aunt. The girl assumed that there was a good reason why Aunt Liana couldn't show up herself, and so she just delivered the family heirloom by parcel. Looking out of the carriage window, our heroine even assumed that her father was now in danger. In any case, she really wanted to meet Liana Mercedes because this person is the only one who can tell her about her real mother. At this point, Rhine turned to Lady Estelle and suggested that the lady was very tired, but she assured her that they would arrive soon, so she needed to be patient for a little while. Our heroine nevertheless waved her hand and just wanted to say that it wasn't about that when suddenly the carriage stopped abruptly, so Rhine looked out the window happily and said that they had most likely already arrived. Estelle felt as if she had been frozen. She was so busy thinking about her own things that she had completely forgotten that they were on the road. As soon as the girl got out of the carriage, it seemed that all eyes of the public were glued to her. Moreover, the girl herself cannot say that she was very happy to be in this place. The reason for this was that she had a whole bunch of knights around her accompanying her. She didn't even know what to do with herself. People looked at her in bewilderment and asked what it was. They assumed that this girl was from some influential family. Seeing the coat of arms, they assumed that she was from the Valois family. One way or another, our heroine was incredibly embarrassed by everything that was happening because her appearance attracted a lot of attention. Rhine nevertheless smiled, and looking at our heroine suggested that she go. Estelle noticed that her escort looked too strangely happy. Our heroine began to walk forward when suddenly she heard a familiar female voice behind her. The fair-haired girl turned to the knight and said that she needed to speak with Lady Estelle. As it turned out, it was Saria who said that she was very lucky to meet her here, so she asked to give her a minute. Our heroine nevertheless wondered why Saria was here. She immediately remembered the ill-fated interview and assumed that the Count and Countess had sent her as a messenger. The girl decided to talk to her one way or another, so she approached the knight and asked him to step aside. Estelle looked at the girl and said that she had an important meeting, so it would be difficult to talk to her. Saria, of course, smiled and said that everything was fine. She assumed that Estelle had some business at the temple, but she would wait for her. Soon she leaned over and said that she had come here to tell Miss Estelle something important, so she should make time for her. Our heroine stared at the girl and wondered, was this the plot of the novel? In any case, the girl nodded her head and told Saria that they would talk later. One way or another, the girl thought about it and decided that it was all because she had awakened memories of her past life as a secondary plan. Estelle, although she wasn't too sure, felt like she had heard something like this before. In any case, if Saria, as expected, did so that, however, at that moment, the priest's voice woke the girl up and she suddenly opened her eyes. Our heroine looked at him in surprise, and the guy apologized and said that he would not interfere in her personal life. He smiled and said he was interested because another patient of his was there that day. Under the words, another patient, and also knowing from the priest himself that he had taken Claude Karlstein for treatment, the girl immediately understood who they were talking about. Anyway, our heroine asked in surprise if this was a serious patient. The priest thought about it and soon said that, to be honest, this was a very serious patient. The man even said that this patient could be more serious than Miss Estelle. The girl immediately turned her head away. Meanwhile, the priest suddenly said that on that very day of the ball, someone had treated his patient That was why he decided that this man was a good healer, because even he, the head priest, magically simply alleviated the symptoms of suffering. Our heroine realized in horror that he knew everything. At that moment, the man said that he was very curious to know the identity of the benefactor who had healed him. A heavy sigh soon followed because, unfortunately, his patient was unable to hold on to that benefactor. However, if he gets another chance, he might not miss it for anything. After that, the priest smiled and said that he had been talking too much and that he was very sorry. He just wanted to tell her this. The girl then sat down, and the man told her that if she was not going to get involved with this patient, he recommended that she definitely avoid him. Our heroine nevertheless thought about the fact that she got involved with him, not because she wanted to, but because she was led by the cries of the little dragon. Anyway, the priest said that the treatment was over for the day, so he was wondering how she was feeling. The girl said that she was very relaxed and calm. The priest was only glad about this, so he told her that they would see each other again next time. After some time, our heroine left the temple and immediately noticed a worried Rhine. The girl was surprised that her maid was talking to Lady Saria and the others. In any case, the girl turned to Lady Estelle. However, Saria was the one who was most pleased with our heroine's appearance and immediately suggested that they move to a quiet place. After a while, the action takes us to one of the local restaurants. Of course, our heroine was accompanied here by Rhine. Anyway, at that moment, Saria turned to the girl and handed her a menu, asking what she would like to eat. Our heroine noticed a certain amount of pretense in Saria's eyes, so she trusted her words with doubt. Anyway, Estelle ran her eyes over the menu and soon pointed to one of the items and said that there would only be tea. Saria immediately exclaimed happily, saying that she also loved jasmine tea, which meant that they had similar tastes. Estelle said that apparently it was soon after some time, desserts and teas were brought to the girl's table. Estelle immediately reached for her cup of tea to take a sip when suddenly Saria approached her and asked her if she had seen today's newspaper. The girl made an upset face and said that her parents really miss her. Our heroine put the cup on the table and, looking at Saria like a madman, asked if they really missed her. The girl nodded her head and said that her parents hoped that Miss Estelle would come home, and of course she hoped so too. Estelle had no doubt that her parents had sent their daughter to talk to her. In any case, she said she didn't know what to tell her. She asked the question directly, asking if they by any chance wanted to bring her back because of the Mercedes legacy and not because of her. In any case, our heroine said that she did not know what their intentions were, but at least she did not think that the Count and Countess would want to see her. Saria asked in confusion if she really didn't believe her words. Estelle immediately nodded her head. Silence hung between them. At that moment, the girl laughed mockingly and put the tea back, saying that it was logical. Our heroine didn't understand what was happening, and Saria at that moment said that she couldn't believe her words because she was thrown out on a cold winter night like trash. In that case, she decided to drop the pleasantries and asked directly whether Miss Estelle had read it. Estelle asked, confused, what she was talking about and what she was supposed to be reading. Saria asked another direct question: had she read that novel? Our heroine, although she was in a stupor but realizing that she had heard everything correctly that night, decided not to show it. The girl sighed and said that she didn't understand what they were talking about. What novel? Saria in turn was more persistent, so she banged on the table and asked him not to lie to her. If this is not true, then how could she so easily abandon her parents and leave without shedding a tear? They raised her for many years. Our heroine, in fact, immediately asked herself a question: if she hadn't refused them and grabbed their pants, would they have thrown her out? In any case, our heroine said that even if she had not refused, nothing would have changed. The girl in turn stated in bewilderment that Estelle should have tried something else because it was obvious. Estelle sighed heavily and decided to ask Miss Saria once again, what does she want to say? At that very moment, Saria grabbed our heroine by the hands and said that they could become good friends because this is an amazing coincidence. She couldn't believe that she had ended up in the book she had read in her past life, but it turned out that there was another person who had experienced the same thing. With crazy eyes, the girl said that it was fate, so she asked to give her place back. Saria said that the Mercedes heritage that Miss Estelle inherited was supposedly the Brienne family. Originally, their family was rich because of that heritage. However, our heroine only pulled her hand away in rage, but due to her abruptness, she accidentally knocked over a mug of tea. She fell to the ground and broke. The aristocrats and our heroine's escort were very tense. Anyway, the girl looked at Saria and asked her not to talk like that about what she had inherited from her ancestors. It was not theirs and would never be theirs. Saria looked at the girl in bewilderment and did not understand what was happening because in her head, everything should have been different. Our heroine finally asked Saria to stop behaving so rudely. Soon the girl turned around and started to leave, but Saria jumped up from her seat and banged the table, saying that everything had been decided from the very beginning. She may have been wronged, but the world put her in that position. Estelle was still walking away when suddenly Saria decided to ask if she really denied that she had read the same book as her. Estelle stopped. Our heroine looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked again, "What book were we talking about?" She still didn't understand what she was talking about. Saria hit the table again, saying that she was just pretending not to know anything. The girl decided to come back and said that she continues to carry strange things about her past life and the world inside the novel. Looking into the shocked eyes of Saria Brienne, our heroine said that this is not a dream but reality. However, our heroine's eyes were no less terrifying. Estelle told Saria that she should wake up when the time came for it. Soon after this, the girl got up from the table and said that she would go because it was already time. Saria, in turn, was devastated. She knew that this simply couldn't be happening. It was impossible for all of this to be real. In any case, our heroine left and the girl's aristocratic friends immediately ran to calm her down. Just before leaving, Rhine still dared to ask the lady if everything was okay. Our heroine smiled and said that everything was fine so she didn't have to worry. But the girl actually felt a strange weight inside her chest. It was hard after that conversation. Remembering Saria's words, our heroine also understood that she was right, because if she had come to the county a little later, she would have been kicked out, and all the inheritance would have been lost. It was this whole situation of her character that made her more and more angry, but that was only in the helpless original. Now, with an inheritance and some protection from the Brienne family, things were completely different. In any case, our heroine smiled, looking at Rhine, and said that everything was fine. The girl was glad to hear this, but still could not help but notice that the lady instantly turned pale. It was necessary to return home quickly. Rhine began to lead Madame Estelle into the carriage, but at that very moment a voice behind them stopped them. Someone asked Miss Estelle to wait. Our heroine turned her head and noticed Lady Brienne's disgruntled friends in front of her. The red-haired girl had no intention of being nice, so she asked in confusion what she had said to Miss Saria. Our heroine, perplexed, said that she hadn't said anything like that, but her friend asked her not to lie because the girl had a grief-stricken expression on her face when she left. Estelle looked at these guys in even greater bewilderment, realizing that they were all worried about Saria. Rhine felt something strange at that moment, so she wanted to intervene, but our heroine said that everything was fine. The girl immediately responded to Saria's friends, saying that if they were interested in this conversation, they would be better off asking Miss Saria herself. However, the girl said that it was not a matter of interest at all, but rather that she would apologize to Mrs. Saria. Our heroine looked at the guys in bewilderment and asked why she should apologize now. But at that very moment, something else caught Estelle's attention. A painfully familiar voice came from behind her. The little dragon sitting on Jean's shoulder told Claude that this was indeed the same girl. It was obvious that our heroine just stared at Claude Karlstein in horror and didn't even know what to say to her. The aristocrat looked at her mistress in bewilderment and decided to ask where she was looking during their important conversation. At that moment, Jean Lambert himself took a step towards Estelle and asked how she was doing. Saria's friends at that very moment looked at Baron Lambert in bewilderment. At the same time, the action takes us beyond the capital. In one of the alleys, the ambassadors of the Archduke were shouting, not understanding where he had gone, how to find him if he decided to hide. His friend nevertheless said that they had to find him as this was an emergency. He was sure that everyone was now cleaning their shoes to look good in the eyes of the heir to the Mercedes family, but where was His Highness? The fair-haired guy himself understood that His Highness should be in the front rows, but he dared to assume that Mr. Karlstein was now in the capital. However, his comrade looked at him again in surprise and asked how this could be. Didn't he know this when everyone was talking about it? The guy smiled and said that if it was His Highness who was leading a reclusive life, then it was quite possible. His comrade sighed, realizing that it made sense. Anyway, the guy said that as with Archduke Karlstein, Claude locks himself away somewhere or hides as soon as the overload symptoms return. Although they both understood that Mr. Karlstein was not some kind of wild animal, the situation was still very urgent, so he had to contact him. The ambassador's assistant looked at the guy and asked what he meant by "with him." The guy adjusted his glasses and said that he was talking about their spy on the side of the crown prince. Meanwhile, the action takes us to our heroine, who still couldn't put the words together to ask how they ended up here. Jean Lambert beat her to it and said that he hadn't even thought that they would meet so accidentally. In any case, he asked if he had interrupted their conversation. Our heroine looked away in bewilderment and said that he had not interrupted them. Meanwhile, Seria's friend looked at the Baron in bewilderment and asked how he could talk to this man. The guy looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant by the words, "with this person." He said that her words seemed a little impolite. The girl apologized and said that it was dangerous for a noble person like the Baron to communicate with such a person. Jean sighed heavily, saying that he didn't know what she meant by danger, but it still didn't sound good. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment, realizing that he was showing that they were close, but not understanding why he was doing it. In any case, the girl at that moment said that she was telling the Baron these words because she was thinking about him. Doesn't he know? The girl explained that after the ball there were various rumors about her. Our heroine immediately became tense. Estelle understood that at this rate this strange girl might mention her white disease, but she simply couldn't allow her to mention it because Claude would understand who she was. The girl said that she may be of good origin, many can support her, but this woman is cursed by God with illness. Our heroine in turn interrupted her and said that she would no longer tolerate such disrespect towards herself, so she told her to leave immediately. Seria's friend who came to seek justice was incredibly shocked by what she heard. Anyway, she stamped her foot in anger and said that they would talk again next time because she still had a lot to tell. The girl started to leave, but at the end she told her not to be rude to Miss Seria. Melinda's friend asked her to stop it all. Our heroes watched these strange guys with bewilderment when suddenly Jean Lambert looked at our heroine and asked Mrs. Sibeli if she was okay. Rhine leaned over in confusion at that moment, not understanding what she had just heard. The girl wanted to correct Mr. Jean by saying that Mrs. Sibeli was different, but our heroine started waving her hand and stopped her. Estelle turned her gaze to the man and said that she wanted to talk to him, so she needed to leave them alone. Rhine smiled and said that she would be happy to leave them. She immediately turned around and began to walk away singing. Claude immediately asked who those girls were. The dragon in turn said that if there weren't so many people around, there wouldn't be ashes left of them. Our heroine, of course, said that she doesn't know them, so she's not worried at all. Claude nevertheless looked at Mrs. Sibeli and asked if she needed help. Estelle said that she was fine. Of course she knew what a terrible help he would give her. By the way, Melinda was a good friend of Seria in the original, so Estelle deserved it. Anyway, she looked at Baron Lambert and asked him to come back quickly because she didn't think his wound had healed yet. The guy in turn said that thanks to her, everything healed for him, and he wanted to ask her something. Looking into the girl's eyes, he asked if he understood correctly that she had not given her real name. Estelle looked down sheepishly and began to say that she had 3 strict older brothers at home and that she would get into trouble if she told her name to a strange man. However, John decided that this was rather strange because at least she could name her. Our heroine wanted to say something, but at that moment Rhine interrupted them because she had information. The girl said that the third Duke was looking for Madame Estelle, so he would be here in a while. Estelle immediately decided that Mr. Alland was coming here, but this could not be allowed. If Claude met him, she would be exposed in the blink of an eye. The girl immediately turned around and said that her brother was looking for her, so it was time for her to run. Jean was perplexed by what had happened and asked the lady to stand for a minute, but the girl still said that it was time for her to go and ran away. The guy was left alone with the dragon. In the end, he didn't hear her real name. The dragon laughed, with Claude saying that she probably didn't like him since she ran away at full speed. Claude snorted and told him to be quiet because the girl herself said that her brother was looking for her. The dragon said that he was a fool because he himself knew that this was an excuse. Either way, they both fixed their gaze on the fleeing stranger, not knowing her real name. The guy clenched his fist tightly, saying that they should meet again, and for this he would search the entire capital. The dragon said that it was sad that they couldn't ask Aaron and Luriu for help, even though they were here too. Claude sighed and said that he was right, that shouldn't be done. The dragon immediately told the owner that he was just being stubborn. However, Claude's appearance was getting worse and worse. The dragon certainly couldn't help but notice this. Soon the action takes us to our heroine who ran to Rhine. The maid, perplexed, said that the mistress could not have been in such a hurry. Our heroine, nevertheless, stood and tried to catch her breath while asking something about Duke Alund. Rhine said that all the preparations for the trip were complete and he just wanted to meet Estelle before leaving. The girl also said that the security guards accompanying them had just gone to see Mr. Allendy. Our heroine then said that because of her, his fun trip could be delayed, so they needed to go quickly. Rhine asked if she had finished talking to that man. She also said that the man had a cute lizard on his shoulder. Estelle immediately froze. She didn't understand what kind of lizard they were talking about, but at that very moment she remembered Mr. Claude's dragon. The girl laughed, realizing that other people saw the dragon as a lizard. She also said that nothing important happened. However, Rhine felt something strange as well as a certain amount of mystery. She immediately asked the lady if she understood correctly, that this was the same person she had met at the ball. Estelle nodded her head. The girl happily began to talk about how they seemed to have become close. Estelle understood that this was not the case at all. In any case, Rhine decided that they should return to the carriage now. The girl suddenly asked if Alund was waiting for them. At first, our heroine did not realize where they were going, but soon she realized that they were talking about the carriage that was standing behind her when she was next to Claude. Soon the girl began to walk forward with only one hope, that he would not be there. As a result, that same evening, fortunately for our heroine, they were able to safely return to the palace. Entering inside, I immediately noticed Alund, who was incredibly happy to see Estelle. Our heroine approached him, asking if he was really leaving already. The guy smiled and nodded his head. However, he admitted that he wanted to accompany her to the next ball or tea party, but unfortunately, it would not work out. Estelle smiled back at him and asked him to return safe and sound from his trip. Alund, at this point, looked at the girl in surprise and asked what trip they were talking about. Rhine, in turn, advised him to keep quiet. Just then, the butler came over and told Mr. Alund that Mrs. Estelle would be bothered by him going monster hunting, so they didn't tell him. The guy said that he understood, so he immediately stroked the girl on the head and said that he would definitely bring gifts, so he advised her to stay healthy. The girl smiled and said that she would wait for him and then asked him again to be careful. That same evening, a carriage filled with supplies left the palace and drove along the path. After the master left, the butler turned to our heroine and asked her to look at something. He led her to the table and, pointing to all these letters with flowers, asked her to say that these were all the invitations addressed to her. Our heroine was incredibly shocked by the entire number, so she asked again. The man said that it was obvious that she had made a successful debut, so he was sure that now the entire high society was very worried that they would not be able to invite her. The girl took one of the letters in surprise and asked if everything would be okay if she went there. The butler smiled at her and told her that she was able to choose one of these many invitations. Also looking at her, he added that if it was a burden to her, then she could refuse everyone. However, noticing one of the signatures on the letter, our heroine said that she would be at this ball. The man was very surprised and asked if she was serious. Our heroine handed over the letter she had chosen and said that she could not avoid social life forever. The girl assumed that she could find clues about her aunt through this social life. Moreover, remembering Maria, who introduced herself as an acquaintance of her aunt, she hoped to meet her at the ball. The butler was looking at the invitation at that moment and soon said that it was the Marquis de Lane's tea party, which meant that she would be busy for some time. Our heroine looked at the man in bewilderment, asking what his words meant. After a while, she was dressed in a different outfit and completely ready for the trip. Duke Lloyd was at this point saying that he had heard that she was going to the Marquis of Delane's tea party, so she couldn't help but prepare. The guy explained that since the weather had become warmer, she would have to complement it with a new dress and accessories. At that moment, Audrey also approached the lady and asked if she had eaten well. Our heroine asked again, in bewilderment. Anyway, at that moment, the second Duke extended his hand to the girl and asked her to go. Our heroine, in turn, was just thinking that she simply did not expect that everything would take on such a scale. In any case, she gave her hand to Mr. Lloyd, and in a moment they were inside the carriage. Estelle looked at the Duke and told him that she wanted to ask him something. The guy asked in surprise what it was. Our heroine said that she wants to know details about her aunt that she doesn't know. Lloyd told her that there had been no significant progress in the search. He had tracked down the postman who had sent the parcel, but had been unable to find out anything else. Liana Mercedes is not an easy target because it is obvious that she is deliberately hiding, which means everything is carefully thought out. Our heroine looked down in bewilderment, not understanding whether her aunt really did not want to see her. Lloyd, in turn, dispelled her thoughts because if that were the case, the woman would not have sent such a note. He assumed there must be another reason, perhaps she was escaping someone's pursuit. Estelle decided there was something to this. The girl immediately asked the Duke if he really thought her aunt was being stalked. She started screaming, saying that if this was true, then she was in danger. The Duke asked the girl to calm down because this was just his assumption, not supported by facts. In any case, in his opinion, this is the most reasonable assumption if someone does not like the fact that the descendants of Mercedes still remain. Anyway, he said that they are trying their best to track her down, but it's her relatives matter, so she must be worried. Our heroine only lowered her head and soon nodded it, saying that she would like to see her aunt unharmed. Lloyd said at this point that the Count and Countess of Brienne were also a problem. The newspaper reported that the Duke's heir would soon appear. Estelle looked at the Duke and said that they would have to make another plan, but she was not sure that these people would not influence it. Lloyd was surprised at first, but soon after he smiled and said that he was interested in how she would fight them. After a while, the action takes us to a luxury clothing store. Immediately, the lady began to joyfully greet the young gentleman, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. Soon the woman approached Estelle and said that she was very curious about what had brought the young gentleman to him, that he even told her to prepare the latest fashionable dress. She certainly didn't expect to see a beautiful young girl with him. In any case, she bowed, saying that it was a great honor for her to serve them today. The woman introduced herself as Madame O'Delly. Our heroine smiled at her and introduced herself as Estelle Mercedes and asked her to take care of her. Madame O'Delly was in incredible shock at that very moment because she recognized the girl's name as that very same Madame Mercedes from the rumors. She was too excited. Lloyd sighed heavily, speaking of the woman's tiresome nature, but still her outstanding abilities outweighed everything, so there was no need to be afraid of her. Anyway, the woman clapped her hands, and at that very moment, 2 other girls appeared next to her. This only meant that it was time to start choosing. After some time, Mr. Valois was sitting on the sofa and reading a book. Just at that moment, Estelle finally emerged from the curtain in a bright yellow dress. Lloyd stared at the girl in bewilderment and could not say a word, but the maids began to enthusiastically tell the lady that it suited her very well. O'Delly at that moment looked at the girl and told her that, as expected, because of her silver hair, all colors suit her. In that case, the woman asked why they didn't try on something sky blue like the dress that appeared in her spring collection. Soon after different dresses followed, O'Delly said that she was like a fairy, incredibly beautiful. She also praised the blue color, which suits her best. By the end of all this, our heroine was even mentally tired. Audrey approached the Duke and asked him which dress he liked the most. Maybe she should try on another dress. Our heroine, however, having heard only the words that there were more dresses, was in incredible shock. Lloyd, of course, noticed this expression on her face, so she got up from the sofa and said that Mrs. Estelle was very tired, so that was enough for today. The guy immediately turned to Madame O'Delly and asked her to pack all the dresses that Madame Estelle had worn today. While our heroine was incredibly surprised, Madame O'Delly only looked at the gentleman with admiration. The woman turned around and said that most likely the Duke liked all the dresses. Anyway, while O'Delly was dressing our heroine, she said that this was the first time the gentleman himself had visited the salon since he was a child with Lady Sibeli. The woman said she had no idea he would be so taciturn. Estelle, puzzled, asked if he was really talking about Lloyd. O'Delly laughed, suggesting that she didn't believe her, but he had been a little hooligan as a child. But what she said was a secret. The woman also added that Miss Sibeli does not wear women's clothing, so it had been a long time since she last saw her. In any case, the woman said that the girl had been like this since childhood. In any case, they couldn't talk forever, so they eventually went down the stairs. Lloyd immediately went to Estelle and said that they had delayed her longer than he thought. The guy asked if she was tired. Our heroine said that she was fine and then thanked Mr. Lloyd. The guy didn't really understand what she was thanking him for now, so he asked in surprise what happened. The girl said that she was grateful to him for taking care of everything and buying a dress and a necklace and earrings. In any case, our heroine said that immediately after the coming-of-age ceremony, she would give him the money. Lloyd started laughing loudly, asking if she was really going to remember every meal and pay back for it. Our heroine sighed heavily, saying that he was right. She forgot to add food to the list. The Duke said it was a joke, and besides, it would take him all day to count everything. In any case, he looked at her thinking that she was tired, so he suggested that she quickly return to rest. However, the action takes us to the Brienne estate, where a whole bunch of maids have gathered near the door of Seria. At that moment, even Lorelia came up and asked in surprise if her daughter hadn't come out yet. The girls sighed and said that it was true. She didn't even respond to their words. The woman came to the door and began to address her daughter, asking her what had happened. Mother was here, so she asked to tell her everything in detail. At this time, the girl was sitting alone in the middle of a dark room on a large bed, all alone. Seria bit her nails, thinking that she had to go back. She had to go back to her original world soon. She decided that the problem was that she had rushed into Brienne's family because she knew the plot of the novel. The girl couldn't even imagine that something like this could happen because this situation was not even mentioned in the novel. It was a little off schedule, but she still decided that it was okay. She was sure that if Seria had a happy ending like the original, she would be able to return to her world. The action takes us to the next morning. The maids looked at the mistress, assuming that she had been waiting for them for a long time. In any case, it was time to start applying makeup. The girl said she would look the best at the tea party today. Estelle smiled and asked to take care of her. One of the maids suddenly said that Miss Sibeli could not stand it when it came to such things, and she even missed those times. Anyway, Audrey laughed and said she was glad Miss Estelle was here before they lost their skills. She even thought that she would spend her whole life cleaning the Duke's chainmail. In any case, soon all the tools were stacked on the table, which meant that everything was finished. The girls looked at Miss Estelle and asked her if she liked the final result. Our heroine raised her head and looked at her reflection, after which she was immediately perplexed. Audrey asked not to be silent and answer her question. Is she silent because she is too delighted? One of the maids proudly said that she had trained herself to braid hair just for today. Rhine suddenly said that she had actually pulled her hair out. Our heroine started laughing, and soon after that she said that she liked it, so she was grateful to them. After some time, Estelle put on her new dress given to her by the Duke and went out into the corridor. Meanwhile, Duke Entangled was waiting for the girl in the corridor, who was surprised that she came out so quickly, but soon he saw her image and was stunned by her beauty. Her smile was both simple and warm. Immediately, the maids came out from behind her, telling the master that their mistress was simply beautiful, wasn't she? She was shining from head to toe. Entangled, of course, agreed with this, but something was bothering him even more, so he asked them to wait. Looking at the umbrella in bewilderment, he asked if it was really going to rain today. One of the maids immediately screamed in bewilderment, telling the Duke that he was completely unaware. The sun umbrella is the latest craze these days, so you need to know. Entangled sighed heavily and said he understood no need to shout. In any case, the guy looked at our heroine and said that Lady Mercedes was great in everything. One way or another, it was time for them to go. Estelle looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked if he was really going with them. Entangled was taken aback by this question. The boy asked Lady Estelle if she was really going to go without an escort. If she was alone, Alland would grumble like a grandfather upon arrival. That's why the Duke asked her to follow him. She doesn't want people to talk about the Duke of Valois and Lady Mercedes being late together, does she? Everything happened too quickly that day, but one way or another, our heroine nodded her head and followed the guy. Soon the action takes us to the Marquise's garden. At this time, a tea party was in full swing. The aristocrats chatted with each other and were happy to meet each other. By the way, they had not been to the imperial palace for a long time. One of them suddenly asked if they didn't think everything here had become much more luxurious than the last tea party. The girl smiled and said that she was sure that the Marquise's wife had worked on it. At that very moment, the girl leaned over and said that there were rumors that Lady Mercedes herself was also invited to this tea party. The girls were surprised and shocked at the same time. Another girl said that this miss had never appeared at a social event since her debut. Her friend answered her that there were rumors that she dropped by the temple from time to time, but her friend interrupted her and said that all this was very interesting, but she had not seen her appear at the ball. One of the aristocrats suddenly started talking about Mrs. Mercedes' gorgeous silver hair. However, another girl disappointed her, saying that she probably hadn't heard the rumors Lady Mercedes didn't have silver hair to begin with. The girl said directly that the lady might have fallen ill with an incurable disease and turned white. All the people were horrified because they understood what kind of disease could cause this. One way or another, at that very moment, the knights announced the arrival of Duke Entangled Valois. All the women were in incredible shock that the Duke of Valois himself would be at such a miserable tea party. The man nevertheless asked his wife to come to her senses. Just at that moment, Duke Entangled stepped out of the carriage, only he turned around and offered his hand. A moment later, he took Lady Mercedes by the hand, and she stepped out of the carriage. The woman, seeing Lady Mercedes as well, was in even greater shock. The man asked his wife if she had the strength to come up and greet them. The woman nevertheless gathered her strength and approached the guests, thanking them for accepting the invitation, because thanks to them, this party was the best in her life. Soon after the couple left, and Entangled told our heroine that it was the wife of the Marquis de Lane, who for some reason was in a strange state. Our heroine sighed, and then turned her head to look for the one she had come here for. But Mrs. Maria is not here. According to the history book the girl found that morning, the following people were close to the Mercedes family: Marquis of Stiljon, Count of Eridian, and Marquis of Chiron. Of these, the only person who was close to the Mercedes family was the Marquise of Stiljon, but she cannot blame the other two families. Even the Stiljon family, which was so powerful, was able to lose all its position. In any case, the girl turned her head and looked at Entangled and asked if there was anyone from the Eridian and Chiron families here. The guy thought for a moment and soon scratched his head, saying that he was bad at remembering faces. However, at that moment, he looked forward and noticed a familiar guy there. Pointing to him, Entangled said that this was Lorenzo Eredion. He was the second son in the family and was good with a sword. Our heroine, having said the guy's name in her head, was surprised that it was such a familiar name. The girl suddenly realized that her memories were blurry, but something should definitely pop into her head. She slowly tried to put the puzzle together, and at that moment, she wondered if it was about him that they said that he was not gifted with intelligence, but honed his skills and became the commander of the Imperial Knights. Our heroine decided for herself that if he was a member of the Eredion family, then perhaps she would be able to dig up something about the Mercedes family. However, at this point, Entangled decided to disturb the girl and asked why she was asking the question so suddenly. She wanted to be friends with him. The guy immediately decided to warn her that Lorenzo was not a particularly interesting conversationalist, and one could even say that there was nothing to talk about with him except perhaps about training with a sword. Either way, our heroine didn't really listen to Duke Entangled, so she just followed along. Approaching the guy, she introduced herself as Lady Mercedes. From such an unexpected meeting, Lorenzo was even a little lost, but still greeted the girl. However, this was not his last meeting, because at that very moment someone else called him. As it turned out, it was Soraya. Only when the guy turned around, the girl noticed that Estelle was standing right in front of him. People immediately began to whisper. They understood that these were the same two ladies from the rumors, so they were curious to whom Sir Lorenzo would speak first. It was obvious that he seemed to be in difficulty. One way or another, at that moment, the guy made his choice and introduced himself to the girl. The guy, in his surprise, even managed to extend his hand to Lady Mercedes to say hello to her. At that moment, Melinda screamed in horror and a strange silence fell over the garden. The girl immediately apologized, saying that she reacted that way because Sir Lorenzo was always ready to shake someone's hand without hesitation. The guy, however, only looked at Melinda in bewilderment, and a whisper broke out around him. People whispered and assumed that all the panic was due to the white disease. Is it really more than that? Our heroine, however, only smirked, for this reaction was familiar to her. She had not hoped that the day would come when she would be truly accepted. However, at that moment, Saria looked at her friend with anger on her face, thinking that she had stated it too obviously and aggressively. Our heroine, however, at this point said that the lady must most likely be conservative about touching, since she was so surprised. Melinda screamed in confusion, and Saria put her hand on her shoulder, starting to tell her friend that even she was surprised by her words. Right after that, the girl smiled and said that she was glad to meet Sir Lorenzo. She introduced herself and said that she wanted to meet him, and now the opportunity came. The guy looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was talking about him. The girl smiled and nodded her head, and soon after looked at Estelle, saying that it was a big surprise to see her here. She thought she heard words about her not attending Soviet events. Our heroine looked at her in surprise and asked if this was really true. Seeing a certain contempt and coldness in Estelle's eyes, the girl dared to assume that she had not yet thawed out towards her. Saria, however, said that although they did not share the same blood, both she and her father and mother considered her, Miss Estelle, part of the family. She also smiled, saying that she had heard rumors that she was happy in the Count's house, as if everything was happening in a dream. That is why the girl decided to invite her to visit the Count's house at least once. Saria was sure that she would see the happy ending of the original and go back to how things were. If she doesn't want to help her, then she doesn't have to. Anyway, at this point, Mr. Enard intervened in the conversation and asked in bewilderment what she was supposed to visit. The guy approached Lady Mercedes and asked where she had gone, because she still had a lot of work to do. Without even giving her a chance to say a word, he grabbed her hand and led her along, saying that everyone wanted to talk to her. Soon they took their leave, and our heroine nevertheless began to converse with Sir Lorenzo. Melinda at this point turned to her friend and said that it was Duke Enard who had never participated in such events, but was accompanying her today. Of course, she thought that there was nothing special about this, because Lady Mercedes was a lady under the protection of the Valois family. However, Saria decided that this was a real problem. Neither Enard nor Lorenzo, who were secondary characters in the original, are interested in her, the main character. Eventually, she began to realize that the story's events had strayed too far from the original. Because of all the factors, the girl began to wonder, will she be able to return everything to normal? Soon our heroine was following the escort and thinking about how in the end she was never able to ask about her family. In any case, she saw in Lorenzo's face that he was ready to tell everything. If there was a chance, she had to talk to him. At this point, Enard turned to the girl and asked her in surprise why she was just standing there and listening to everything like a fool. Our heroine looked down in embarrassment and said that she couldn't just up and leave. The guy, however, was even more perplexed and shouted and said that she could have come up with an excuse. However, the girl said that she did not want to do that. Since her debut, she has decided that she no longer hides and does not avoid it. That's why she stood there listening to all the nonsense, because she wanted to finish the conversation herself. The guy sighed heavily, suddenly laughed, and said that now it seemed he was the fool, not her. Estelle asked what he was talking about, to which Enard replied that he kept forgetting that she was more stubborn than she actually appeared. Anyway, he decided that he had done something wrong because of his irritation, which he could not really hide. Now he wanted to eat something tasty. However, at that moment, the guy heard a strange rustling sound and soon a figure. At that very moment, he turned around and told the girl that he would be back soon. Estelle looked at him in bewilderment and asked where he was going. The guy smiled at her and said that he needed to check something, and in the meantime she could sit down and eat something. Our heroine nodded her head and asked him to come back as soon as possible. Soon, she was left alone in the garden, and it even seemed to her that she was experiencing that very feeling of déjà vu. Anyway, at that moment, a woman appeared behind her and asked the girl if she understood correctly that this was the Mercedes lady from the rumors. Estelle turned around, but the woman said that, to be honest, she was a little surprised earlier because she didn't think that she would strike back like that. But still, the most surprising thing was that the boring concept that the white disease is contagious still exists. Our heroine looked at this girl in bewilderment, not understanding who she was and what she wanted. In turn, the stranger decided to introduce herself, and holding out her hand, she said that her name was Camille, and she was the second daughter of Count Jean. The girl cautiously extended her hand and greeted Miss Camille. The girl suddenly asked Estelle if she would mind if they sat down together. Without thinking twice, our heroine decided to agree with her, as she was interested in what she could tell. Already sitting at the table, Camille said that she was very surprised when she heard rumors about her debut. It goes without saying, but this is the Mercedes family. In any case, she found out everything too late because she was not in the capital. Camille suddenly noticed a strange expression on Lady Mercedes's face, so she asked if she was uncomfortable. Our heroine began waving her hands, saying that this was not the issue at all. The girl explained that she did not expect anyone to talk to her first. After her conversation with Miss Saria, Camille turned her head towards the crowd of people and asked if they were talking about the rumors about the white disease. The girl couldn't do anything but laugh. One way or another, she couldn't wait to talk to her, so at that moment the girl realized that she was speaking too bluntly. Camille apologized and said that she didn't like the aristocratic way of speaking, even though she was an aristocrat herself. Our heroine smiled sheepishly and said that she was worried about both the rumors about the illness and the rumors about Brienne's family. Camille asked if she understood correctly that she was now talking about the rumors that she abandoned Brienne's family. Estelle didn't expect to hear any other question. Everyone took it that way. By the way, when Valois first received the newspaper, the contents of the Count and Countess's interview were already known to everyone. Since Saria said those words, public opinion will inevitably turn to the Brienne family. Our heroine eventually dropped her head heavily and leaned on the mug of tea. However, she was pulled out of her thoughts by Camille asking if it was true. At that moment, Estelle stood up abruptly and looking at the Count's second daughter, Jean asked what she was talking about. The girl asked another question. Is it true that she abandoned Brienne's family who sacrificed themselves for her all their lives as biological parents? Our heroine, of course, shook her head and said that this was not so. Camille sighed heavily and said that she was probably wrong about people. Anyway, if it wasn't true as she said, then why was she so obsessed with these rumors? Our heroine wanted to say something, but the girl interrupted her and told her not to pay attention to people. She must understand that this is her life, not theirs. A short silence soon fell between them, accompanied only by the singing of birds. Estelle thanked Camille anyway, and said that she couldn't help but pay attention to the rumors. She doesn't have time to worry about her own life. She explained that she was determined to move forward, but ended up just standing still. Anyway, the girl smiled sincerely and thanked the girl again for her words. She is a very good person. Camille was incredibly shocked by such a sincere confession, so she was enveloped in a stupor. While our heroine did not understand what was happening to her, the girl tried to stop her heartbeat, also trying to understand when she was last praised like that. Estelle decided to turn to her and ask if everything was okay. The girl turned around and cleared her throat. She immediately said that if Lady Mercedes had time next time, she would be glad to see her at a ball at her home. Our heroine was very surprised and asked in bewilderment if she could really come. Did she really have a friend? At the same time, the action moves to the garden where Duke Entangled walked and seemed to be looking for something. The guy looked around and knew for sure that he wasn't imagining things. He definitely saw the guy who was chasing Estelle. Taking his cloak into his hands, Entangled only came to the conclusion that judging by the remaining traces, the enemy had enough strength to escape. The boy soon stood up and stared at the tree, trying to guess where the intruder could have gone. However, at that very moment, Entangled heard a strange rustling sound in the bushes, so he immediately turned around to look at his opponent. In the end, it turned out that it was just a bewildered rabbit eating grass. The guy sighed heavily, upset that in the end he was never able to see the man in person. To his regret, he still had to return back to Mrs. Mercedes. Soon he came to the same place where they were, and finally noticing Estelle sitting at the table, he turned to her. Camille immediately stood up and bowed, and our heroine asked in surprise what he wanted to check. Entangled turned his head away, saying that he didn't want to find anything like that. He just thought he saw someone familiar. Nevertheless, our heroine noticed in his gaze the same mystery that she had noticed last time in the temple. Meanwhile, Entangled assumed that they were still being followed by that guy from Karanka, but in that case, the only question that interested him was who and why assigned this task. Soon the action takes us back to the palace. Walking down the corridor, Entangled asked his brother if he tried to contact his father. Lloyd looked at Entangled in confusion and asked what he was talking about. The guy sighed heavily and repeated that Estelle was apparently being followed. The guy explained that he had missed him this time, but the guy he had seen at the temple last time was a member of the Karanka Guild. Unfortunately, he was unable to sort out the details because he simply committed suicide. But in that case, Entangled only understood that if the guy had even committed suicide, then they clearly had something to hide. Lloyd asked his brother why he hadn't taken care of everything. If he had stopped the suicide or the escape, his father wouldn't have to know. In any case, the guy said that they should sort it all out themselves. The father is already busy and can't attach any importance to it. Entangled then decided to ask his brother if he had any idea who these guys were. Without thinking twice, Lloyd said that it was most likely the work of the Crown Prince or Archduke Karlstein. He thought it was definitely one of them. Entangled said that Karlstein is especially suspicious now. When the truth came out that Estelle is a descendant of Mercedes, he also suddenly came out into the open. Lloyd agreed with his brother, but first they needed to strengthen the security around the mansion and find more ways to protect Miss Estelle. By the way, he looked at his brother and asked him where she was now. Looking at his hand, the guy said that he had something for her. Entangled was surprised and said that the girl was now in the training building. At that moment, Lloyd stopped and looked at his brother in bewilderment and asked again where she was. Entangled looked at his brother in the same surprised way and told him that she was training. She said that she wanted to improve her physical strength, so she was learning simple sword movements. However, the guy said that even if her physical strength increased after undergoing treatment, it would not be enough by the standards of an ordinary person. Lloyd said that he was certainly surprised and then asked if Estelle was alone in the training room. Meanwhile, the action takes us to our heroine, who, accompanied by a loud cry, ran towards the mannequin and punched it. Of course, Estelle was not alone. She also had a support group in the form of maids who shouted and told the girl that she was doing well. However, at that moment, a male voice was heard telling the girl that she was probably a little tired, and therefore it would be better to take a break. It was Duke Lloyd. Our heroine embarrassedly hid the sword behind her back and asked if he had really seen her strike. The boy smiled and told her that she was doing much better than he thought. The wooden sword here must be heavier than the usual wooden swords elsewhere. In any case, he advised her to train on the doll after she had developed her physical strength. The girl smiled and nodded her head. Our heroine said that most likely because she decided to actively participate in social life in the future, she wanted to train more. In addition, the girl said that the chief priest recommended that she take up light sports. Lloyd smiled at her and said that in any case she had received many invitations, and in particular he had come because he thought she would be pleased with this invitation. Handing over an envelope with an invitation, the man said that it was an invitation from the family of the Marquise of Stiljon. The guy added that he was the closest confidant of the Mercedes family before she was exterminated. Perhaps he knows something useful about her aunt. Our heroine listened attentively to Duke Lloyd and nodded her head. Soon he advised her to finally read what was written there. Opening the letter, she began to read. With the arrival of spring, there will be a small tea party in the newly renovated conservatory. It would be very nice if Lady Mercedes would join. Lloyd smiled and asked the girl if she would go there, to which our heroine immediately and happily nodded her head. The maids immediately shouted with joy, saying that she would come there and show off their skills. Then they asked what dress she would wear this time. However, at this point, Duke Lloyd turned to the girl again and asked if she had seen anyone suspicious or if she had perhaps been involved in something strange. This question took the girl by surprise, and as soon as memories flashed through her head, she realized that there was a lot of things. But what should she do? Although if you think about it, most likely Lloyd is asking about Claude. The girl thought that they would not meet again after that day, but they continue to bump into each other in unexpected places. Lloyd immediately noticed that Estelle's face had changed, and she was lost in her thoughts, so he asked her in surprise if everything was okay. Nevertheless, the girl still decided to say that nothing like that happened, because either she or Rhine accompanies her every time. The man nodded his head and soon after turned around and called the maid Rhine to him. The girl who was talking to the other maids upon hearing Mr. Valois' question immediately responded. The man asked to talk to him for a short while, after which they went somewhere together. Our heroine understood that even if Claude magically changed his appearance, Lloyd would notice it. That's why the girl prayed to all the gods so that Rhine would keep everything a secret. However, seeing the worried lady, she only waved and said that she would be there soon. Our heroine realized with horror that Rhine apparently did not understand anything. This is a failure. Audrey looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she needed to rest. The girl immediately raised her head and with a forced smile said that everything was fine. She didn't have any pain. She was just thinking about her own things. At this moment, another maid approached our heroine and asked when the next social party to which she had been invited would be. Estelle looked at the letter and soon said that it would be in 3 days. It was just a tea party anyway, so no need to bother. However, Audrey asked the lady in bewilderment how she could say such a thing. No matter whether it is a small or a large tea party, you always need to prepare. Once again, the maid looked at her mistress and asked if she was tired. Estelle looked at her in surprise and said that she seemed to be feeling fine. In that case, Audrey happily said that they would start choosing a dress right away. The action takes us 3 days forward. The carriage arrived at the house of the Marquis of Stiljon this morning. Soon the door of the same carriage opened and our heroine stepped out, showing herself in all her glory. It would be good to get a hint about her aunt today. Anyway, at the entrance, the butler met Mrs. Mercedes and greeted her. They lead her to the greenhouse. In just a moment, the action takes us to the greenhouse, from which a joyful female voice immediately begins to be heard, thanking Lady Estelle for having come all this way. The woman asked if she was tired, to which Estelle replied that the carriage ride had taken 10 minutes. Everything was fine. Maria Stiljon still asked the guest to sit down. There was also a little girl sitting at the table who smiled sweetly at Estelle and asked her to help herself. Our heroine couldn't contain her emotion, so she giggled happily and smiled broadly. At that moment, Maria unconsciously stared at the girl and even thought a little. Soon after a short pause, she told the girl that she and Liana had the same smiles. The woman sighed heavily and said that she was a cheerful child. She always smiled brightly, not aristocratically. Even the etiquette teacher was worried. Anyway, Lady Stiljon looked at Lady Mercedes and asked if she would mind going for a walk together. Of course, our heroine agreed, so a couple of seconds later they were leaving the greenhouse. After some time, the action moves to a small town. The woman suddenly apologized for her sudden request. She explained that in the presence of strangers, one should be careful about asking about her. Estelle said that everything was fine because she wanted to talk to her too. The woman immediately asked the girl if she was currently living well in the Duchy of Valois. Estelle smiled and nodded her head, indicating that she was happy there and that everyone was taking care of her. But something was bothering her. The girl turned to Mrs. Maria and asked if she knew by any chance how she had suddenly received the Mercedes inheritance. Looking at Lady Stiljon, the girl explained that her aunt had passed on the legacy to her. The woman was incredibly happy to hear this, so she sharply asked if Liana had really personally handed over the inheritance to her. Lady Stiljon was really turned on by these words. She couldn't stop asking questions, trying to understand if Liana was alive. Our heroine in turn explained that her aunt had only sent a parcel, but if you look at the contents of the postcard, it becomes clear that she is alive. Maria was still confused because Liana was the one who led the blockade of the Imperial army when it invaded. How could this happen then? Soon the woman leaned over, saying that if this was true, she wondered where Liana had been hiding for all these 17 years. They hadn't found a single trace of her in such a long time. Our heroine looked at Lady Stiljon, realizing that this was right after the family was destroyed. The late king was still alive, so it was no wonder Liana was hiding. However, now the former king is dead. The current emperor visited their graves and apologized, and the family's honor was restored. But then the main question remains only one. Why did the aunt hide, and what was she afraid of for 17 years? Our heroine immediately told Lady Stiljon that she wanted to know why her aunt was still hiding and where exactly. Maria lowered her head and said that she only guessed that she was alive, but if she thought about it, the crown prince might know something. Immediately before our heroine's face, there appeared a memory of that ill-fated night in which the crown prince was incredibly angry and was looking for someone with the help of her father. At this point, Stiljon said that Joachim had been interested in the Mercedes family for some time. Allegedly, this was done in order to restore its reputation. However, all the talk was always about the search for the dragon's tear, which has not been found to this day. Soon, Maria leaned over to Estelle and said that, to everyone's surprise, the search had suddenly stopped. They said that the dragon's tear was with them because they found it. But is the relic really with Estelle now? Our heroine lowered her head, and the woman said that perhaps if the prince had found a relic, it was far from a dragon's tear. Estelle wondered about the crown prince. If he really wanted the family heirloom, he knew 100% whose hands it was in. She understood that all the threads led to him. which meant that he had to help her with the next step. At that very moment, our heroine heard someone's incredibly joyful cries because she had met Lady Estelle on a walk. Turning her head, the girl noticed Lorelia in front of her, who with a forced smile said how happy she was to see her here. The aristocrats standing around only smiled joyfully and sweetly at Lorelia's attitude towards her abandoned daughter. Our heroine, in turn, as soon as her mother came closer, only asked what business she had come for. The woman said that there was no need to speak so rudely to her, she was going to visit her anyway. Anyway, she had great news. Lorelia shouted out words indicating that His Highness the Crown Prince had said that he would personally invite her to the palace ball. The ladies around immediately began to whisper, "The palace is a place where the people close to the Crown Prince can be invited." They were perplexed and only said that they had never heard of someone as young as Estelle being invited there. Lorelia was happy to play the scene among the people. Our heroine, in turn, just stood silently and looked at her mother, making it clear with her whole appearance that she was unpleasant to her. Lady Stiljon noticed the same thing. Anyway, Lorelia approached her daughter and asked if she would be present, as it was a great honor. Stiljon laughed to herself at that moment, realizing that honor was a strong word. The Mercedes family is in decline now, so it doesn't have anyone to thank for being invited by the Emperor's son. Looking at Countess Brienne, she realized that this was the very woman who had spoken badly of Estelle in her article. At that moment, our heroine looked at her mother in surprise and asked if she had just said that the Crown Prince had invited her to his place. Lorelia screamed with delight and said that he seemed to have a special interest in her. At that moment, the girl came even closer to our heroine and, grabbing her hand, asked why this happened. Looking into her daughter's eyes, the woman only hoped that she would get angry. She hoped that Estelle would let out her emotions like last time and thus show how angry she was towards her parents. In any case, the woman continued to stand over the girl's soul and rush her, saying that she needed to make a decision faster. Meanwhile, our heroine was enveloped in an unknown stupor. She couldn't even move. The girl did not understand what was happening to her and tried to stop herself. She understood that she needed to be confident in front of these people. Clenching her eyes tightly over and over again, she begged herself to stop and come to her senses. However, at this point, the action takes us back to the girl's childhood. The attending physician examined Estelle. The man soon looked at the girl's parents in surprise, and she in turn turned her head sharply. Anyway, Al Dente was perplexed and said that everyone understood that she had the white disease. She was of no use, and even a village baron would have a hard time marrying someone like that. Lorelia sighed heavily at this point and said that God was indifferent. What a pity. She approached the girl, saying that they had raised her for 12 years, but still had not received anything in return. Estelle looked at her parents with guilty eyes and began to reach out her hand to her, asking them to forgive her. The woman in turn instantly jerked away, screaming that this little brat had touched her skin. At that very moment, she hit the girl, asking how she, a white ghost, dared to touch her. Al Dente approached his wife and asked her in surprise why she was so careless. In any case, he turned around and said that they had better get out of here because who knows, maybe there are bacteria in the air too. Soon the door of the room began to close, and all the girl saw was only the closing gap from the door, which would soon leave her alone in the darkness. All these thoughts enveloped our heroine at once, so she could not move. But at that moment, Mrs. Stiljon approached Lady Estelle and hugged her. The woman asked her to leave here, and at the same time, in her quiet and calm voice, she calmed her down, saying that everything was okay. Lorelia was shocked by what had just happened. Was this really how they decided to fight her back? The woman immediately turned her head to the side to find out what the aristocrats were whispering about. Previously, the touched girls said in bewilderment that they thought that they had a good relationship, but if that were the case, the daughter would not be shaking so much in front of her mother. However, the woman was furious. It was all wrong. She was a child who had abandoned her parents once she had the good fortune to quickly become rich. She in turn parents who want to treat her as before, but she was abandoned alone. This was her plan, but what is happening now is disgusting. Anyway, Mrs. Stiljon still stood next to the tearful Estelle and tried to calm her down. After this, the woman looked up and said that Madame Estelle certainly did not want to talk anymore, so they would go. They soon turned around and headed in their direction, while Lorelia only watched them with an angry look. She was very angry. After some time, our heroine and Lady Stiljon were walking through the town together, but fortunately in silence. Estelle had previously thought that she could face this with confidence, but hadn't enough time passed for the wound to heal. However, at that moment, Maria turned to the girl. Our heroine immediately came to her senses and began to apologize for what had happened. The woman smiled and told her that she didn't have to tell her all this. However, everything is still on the hands of Lady Estelle. The woman determined that she is still incredibly ill. Taking Estelle's hand, the woman said she had no idea how hard it was for her. She should never have stopped looking for traces of Liana. Maria unfortunately could not help her, but will do everything possible to stay close to Estelle. The woman smiled and promised to be of use to her, and then tears began to flow from her eyes. The very next day, our heroine walked next to Duke Entangled, trying to understand what had happened yesterday. The girl understood that she simply could not calm down until Maria took her away with her. At this moment, Duke Entangled looked at the girl in surprise and asked why she was sighing so heavily. Was she really tired already? Our heroine said that this was not the case at all. In fact, she had received an invitation from the Crown Prince to the ball. These words struck Entangled like lightning. At first, he did not understand what her words meant. Only after realizing what she had said did he remind her that he had asked her to send the Crown Prince away in a situation like this. Anyway, the girl told him that yesterday afternoon there were several people who heard that His Highness had invited her. The guy immediately realized that he had done it so that she simply could not refuse him. What nonsense. Anyway, he told her that if she didn't want to go there, she shouldn't. His reputation shouldn't concern her. However, our heroine looked at Mr. Entangled and told him that she wanted to go there. The girl explained that the Crown Prince might have information about her aunt. He really didn't like this idea, but he still said that he agreed, but he would go there with her. He apologized, saying that he wouldn't say anything like, "go alone normally," or anything like that. Entangled didn't trust that idiot Crown Prince too much. He was a snake. If she went alone, something might happen. However, their conversation was interrupted by the joyful cry of Duke Alund, who ran towards them and waved his hand. Our heroine didn't understand how he ended up there, but as soon as the guy approached, he started asking if everything was okay. Looking the girl over from different angles, he told her that she seemed to have become rosier than the last time they saw each other. Had she put on weight? After that, he looked at Entangled and asked in confusion what had happened. The guy asked his brother to stop acting like that. Moreover, how did he know they were here? Anyway, our heroine interrupted them and said that they seemed to have returned much sooner than expected. Did he enjoy the trip? The guy thought for a moment. The trip, if you think about it, really turned out to be very interesting. Without thinking twice, he smiled and said that he liked everything. It was fun. Moreover, at that moment, the guy said that he had brought her a gift. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked what kind of gift it was. He held out a small box and said it was for her. The girl continued to look in surprise, first at the gift, then at the Duke's. Anyway, she opened the latch and opened the box anyway. In front of her, she saw a gorgeous pendant. The guy scratched his head in embarrassment, and from the girl's reaction, he assumed that she didn't like it. He just bought it on the way back, but she probably didn't like it that much. Our heroine screamed in bewilderment and said that this was not so he should not say that. The girl smiled happily and said that it was very beautiful, and she was very happy with this gift. In this case, the guy smiled happily and said that he would explain how to use it. Estelle asked in confusion what this meant, and Mr. Allen told her that there was actually a bit of magic in it. He asked the girl to touch the necklace with her finger and say the word Ilero. At that very moment, an unknown aura was created around her, which pushed the Dukes in different directions. The girl looked at Mr. Entangled and Allen in confusion and asked if he was okay. Allen just gave a thumbs up. Soon, he got up from the ground and said that, as expected, the functionality of this relic is very good, so he is satisfied. As she already understood, this is the magic of creating a shield in a radius of a foot. He explained that a person standing next to this aura is thrown back in this way. The guy suggested that the girl try using the relic again. Our heroine screamed in bewilderment and said that this would definitely be enough. At that point, the guy smiled and asked if she would carry it with her every day. Estelle was very pleased that they were worried about her. Of course, she could do nothing but smile and agree. Soon, the action moves to the next day. Rhine told the lady that today they arrived at the temple a little earlier than usual, so she suggested that they take a walk. Our heroine said that it was a good idea, and Rhine immediately noticed that the lady was in a good mood today. Yesterday she had no energy and that's why she was worried. Estelle was surprised that she had made her worry without even knowing it. Anyway, Rhine said that she was glad that she was full of energy and now she would get the shawl from the carriage. Soon after this, the girl left and our heroine, turning her head, noticed a strange object lying on the ground. Coming closer, she noticed that it was a feather, so she was surprised. But who did it belong to? The girl looked up and noticed a small lump on one of the branches watching her. Our heroine looked at this rabbit in bewilderment and did not understand why he was on the tree. However, at that very moment, the cute creature jumped from the branch and flew towards our heroine, who was already ready to catch the animal. A moment later, the little creature landed, and Estelle realized that it was far from being a rabbit. One way or another, in a moment, the action takes us to the temple. Our heroine ran in bewilderment and called the priest. Rhine ran after her. The man looked at the girl in surprise and asked what had happened. Why was she in such a hurry? It was not yet time for their meeting. The girl said that the rabbit had gotten hurt when it fell from the tree, so she asked for help with it. Looking at the creation in the girl's hands, he asked Lady Estelle to calm down and explain everything more slowly. However, having taken a closer look at the creature, he immediately became thoughtful and soon said that it was not a rabbit at all, but a spirit. Our heroine looked at the priest in surprise and asked what kind of spirit this was. After some time, the girl told the story of how she found him in the temple garden. However, looking at the little creature, the man said that it was strange because the spirit should be in the Sangos forest and not lying like this. Our heroine, hearing the words about the Sangos forest, asked if this was the place famous for its race born with supernatural abilities. The man smiled and said that it was, but it seemed that this spirit was still very small. He thought that it had managed to escape after being attacked by a predator. However, the problem was that the pollution caused by the evil energy seemed to be much more serious than his wound. At that moment, the priest looked at the girl and said that he thought she could help him. Estelle asked in confusion, "How?" The man immediately reminded that Mercedes' power was also given by God, so it would be able to heal the evil energy pollution. The girl asked in surprise how she could do this. The priest asked her not to worry because one attempt would be enough. Looking at the little spirit, he also said that immediately after the attempt, she should act on instinct. The girl immediately began to try to use her magic. She begged for this little life to forget the pain and feel good. Sparks and glows flew around the girl and the spirit, who at that moment began to emit a quiet squeak. Our heroine soon began to open her eyes, hoping to see what she had done. At that very moment, she saw in front of her small eyes, in which there was a lot of happiness and kindness. Our heroine screamed joyfully, and looking at the priest, asked if she had succeeded. The man smiled and walked up to her, saying that she had an absolutely amazing start. He also heard that the second daughter of the former Mercedes family had a brilliant talent, but maybe Madame Estelle was even more talented than her. Our heroine, perplexed, asked who this second daughter was, to which the priest said that her name was Liana Mercedes. Realizing that the priest might know something about her aunt, the girl decided to ask him directly if he knew any information about her. The man said he wasn't sure since he lived mostly here, so he knew little about the affairs of the imperial capital. However, the priest looked at the girl in surprise and asked if the people from the Valois mansion where she lived would not be better informed about the rumors about Mercedes. He doesn't know for sure about the brothers because they are young, but if she asks the Duke, perhaps he will know something and help her. One way or another, he said that the time for talking was over because it was high time to start treatment. The man offered to take the spirit and hold it for now, but for some reason he didn't let go of Estelle's hand. Our heroine looked at the priest in bewilderment and asked what this meant. He himself did not understand what was happening. After some time, the action takes us to the Valois palace, where the girl told the whole story of this sweet but faithful little spirit. Alund said that she did the right thing by bringing him here, and then saying that the creature was incredibly cute. He wanted to pet him. However, for some unknown reason, the spirit did not want this, so it defended itself from the hands of the Valois brothers. Alund suddenly felt a heat in his hand. Our heroine, however, immediately began to scold the little creature of the forest, saying that he should not attack people. Alund and Enard looked at the spirit in surprise and said that he behaved completely differently with Lady Estelle. By the way, does he use magic if he is a spirit? Ignoring the question, our heroine merely thoughtfully asked the brothers if they by any chance knew when the Duke would return. Alund replied that his father had told him that he would go to the magic tower, so he would probably return within this month. The girl replied that she wanted to ask if he knew anything about the rumors about the Mercedes family. Entangled immediately said that he had heard that people from the Mercedes family used their power through their voice. The guy said that this is how descendants should recognize each other. Alund suddenly remembered the wife of the Marquise of Stiljon, so he asked if she really didn't know anything. Entangled replied that the family had been under the closest surveillance during Mercedes' exile, so they knew little. Estelle said that was true. At this point, Alund began to approach Estelle and say that his brother had already asked for information about that person. He also assured the girl that they would also help in any way they could, so she shouldn't worry too much. He began to reach out to her with his hand, but at that very moment the spirit of the forest shocked the guy, causing Alund to scream in surprise. The guy immediately asked in bewilderment what he had done that the spirit hated him so much. It was maddeningly offensive. Entangled told his brother that he looked big and menacing. Meanwhile, the action moves to the palace of the Crown Prince. The butler entered His Highness's room and said that a reply had arrived from Estelle Mercedes. Looking at the letter, he saw only agreement. He didn't think Valois would like it, but he guessed they weren't keeping her locked up. As a result, as he expected, they still strived to pretend to be fair. He was angry, saying that they were like hunting dogs that drowned in someone else's blood. However, at this moment, the butler turned to His Highness and said that Vermont Alsace requested an audience. Joachim asked in confusion who they were talking about. The guy replied that it was the judge presiding over the Brienne family's trial. The Crown Prince immediately grinned slyly and asked the butler to let the judge into the room. The very next evening, the butler met Lady Estelle at the entrance to the Crown Prince's palace, saying that they were waiting for her, and a member of the Valois family was also expected. Duke Alund said his name wasn't on the invitation, but he came as a guard. "Is everything all right?" The man cleared his throat in surprise and said that everything was fine. Our heroine understood that this was probably a trap of the Crown Prince, but she would have to face it anyway. Already walking along the corridor, Alund turned to our heroine and said that he had not thought that he would have the opportunity to accompany her so quickly. Estelle smiled as she looked at the Duke and thanked him for coming here with her. The guy smiled back at her and said that from now on he would often accompany her. After some time, they came to the banquet hall where the whole crowd enveloped Lady Mercedes, saying that they were glad to meet her. However, she noticed a familiar face in the middle of the crowd. Could it really be Claude in the guise of Jean Lambert? The guy nevertheless asked the lady what had happened. Why was she looking at him like that? The girl immediately caught herself thinking that something was wrong. The voice seemed different to her. The guy smiled anyway and told the lady that he forgot to introduce himself. With a smile on his face, he bowed and said that his name was Jean Lambert. It was a great honor for him to meet such a popular Lady Mercedes. Looking at this man, our heroine clearly understood that he really was Jean Lambert. The girl smiled, and the defense said that she was pleased to meet him. The guy was surprised that she knew his status. "It's an honor." Estelle looked away in embarrassment, realizing that she had overdone the game a little. At that very moment, they began to announce that His Highness the Crown Prince was already here. All the people bowed before him, and Joachim went straight to Lady Estelle, saying that he was glad to meet her in person. At that very moment, he sat down on one knee and, holding out his hand, asked if she would give him her palm. The girl, without even realizing what was happening, gave him her hand, and he immediately approached her. Our heroine was in incredible shock from what was happening. Why did he do it so suddenly, and for what purpose? The Crown Prince introduced himself and soon said that he was pleased to welcome Mercedes' successor. The girl smiled shyly and asked him to take care of her to herself. She thought that she wanted to wash her hand. Meanwhile, the ladies around were perplexed about her status being lower than his, but His Highness the Crown Prince was very cordial. Could it be that he? At this point, Joachim admitted that he had wanted to greet her earlier, but only now was he able to find the time. Soon, Alund came up asking His Highness if he was doing well. The prince also smiled falsely, telling the Duke of Valois that it was nice that he decided to visit him even though he was not invited. The boy said he knew he wasn't an invited guest, but he was worried about sending a girl here alone. The prince said he was talking as if they were family. Alan said that if they lived under the same roof, then it was about the same thing. In any case, the prince asked if she had spoken to those who had come here. Our heroine said that she had only managed to talk to Baron Lambert. Joachim immediately said that Jean was one of his close friends. To say that Estelle was surprised that Jean Lambert was the crown prince's man would be an understatement. After a while, the banquet was in full swing. People were dancing, talking, eating. Our heroine was also busy, only she had to greet more people than during her debut. The girl looked at Mr. Alland and said that she would go out onto the terrace for a short while. The guy immediately offered to go with her, but Estelle reminded him that she had the artifact he gave her, so everything would be fine. The guy sighed sadly and said that in that case he would come for her a little later. After some time, our heroine finally went out onto the balcony to breathe some fresh air. However, she won't be able to be alone, because at that moment someone opened the door and began to come inside. Of course, it was the crown prince who also went out to get some fresh air. After all, the wind that is felt in this palace is especially pleasant. Our heroine smiled at him and said that he was definitely right about that. Soon after, Joachim looked at the lady and asked if she had already adjusted to the life of Mrs. Mercedes. The girl just sighed heavily and said that absolutely everything was unusual for her right now. She had never dreamed of wearing an expensive dress or having a conversation with His Highness the Crown Prince before. The Crown Prince thought it was very cute. To be more precise, she was a simple girl, which meant she was just a lamb that could be easily controlled. At that moment, the girl looked at Joachim and asked if he knew something even more amazing. She said that her aunt, who didn't even know about the existence of the treasure box, delivered it to her herself, the dragon's tear. The guy looked at her in bewilderment and asked again if Liana had really handed it over herself. In general, our heroine, as expected, understood that this man knows everything, or rather, that the aunt could not hand over the treasure on her own. Joachim sighed thoughtfully at this point and suggested that Lady Mercedes must be very pleased. Estelle was overcome with trembling at that moment. Why didn't she answer? Even though she tried not to tremble, it was scary. She didn't know if Joachim had really hurt her aunt or not, but if he had, then However, at that moment, she decided to put aside all obsessive thoughts, deciding that the prince should not reveal that she doubted. At that very moment, the prince turned to the girl and asked if he could ask a question. Lady Mercedes nodded her head, and the prince, without thinking twice, immediately asked how long she intended to rely on the Valois family. He said they were obviously a great family, but it was still a house where only boys lived. Joachim suggested that it would be burdensome for a lady to rely on them for long periods of time. Our heroine responded to this by saying that she might be in their debt. In response to this, the crown prince said that among the mansions he owned, there was one that was in no way inferior to the lady's residence, and it was empty. He explained that he was not quite suitable for her status as Mrs. Mercedes, but if she did not mind, she could feel free to use it. The girl felt that now it did not look like he was returning part of the confiscated property of Mercedes, but rather that he was handing over his own mansion. Estelle was furious at the thought that he could neglect her or her family. The girl thanked him for the offer, but she still does not plan to leave the Valois mansion anytime soon. The prince apologized, saying it was a bold offer. However, he sighed heavily, saying that he was a little worried about her. Estelle looked at him in surprise and asked what it meant. The guy said that he was worried only because one girl lived with men. At this point, he brought up the topic of how they could even lose their minds due to overload. The guy also said that it was possible to take into account the fact that they were young guys, which meant our heroine interrupted him at this point. The girl told His Highness that the dukes were in no way worthy of such impudent suspicion, and therefore asked him to refrain from such judgments. The crown prince looked at her in bewilderment, wondering how she even dared to be angry with him. Looking at her face, he knew that her trust in the Valois family was much stronger than he thought, because the first one to take her under his wing was the owner. One way or another, he is confident that he will be able to quickly lure her to himself. The guy immediately said that there was a misunderstanding. The guy started to tell Mrs. Mercedes something, but at that moment, our heroine noticed something strange. Looking out the window, she noticed a bewildered Mr. Alland who did not know what to do. The girl immediately apologized to His Highness and said that if he had nothing more to say, she would go. The crown prince didn't even have time to react properly before Mrs. Mercedes had already run inside. Meanwhile, Alland immediately started asking a bunch of questions. Was she okay? What did they talk about? By the way, he noticed that she had somehow turned pale. Our heroine nevertheless began to calm him down and say that everything was fine. To herself, she thought that she no longer wanted to be here. Remembering the strange words of His Highness that he had just spoken, the girl hoped that she was not thus bringing trouble upon the Valois family. Our heroine suddenly turned to Mr. Alund and said that she would go wash her hands. After a while, the girl wandered into a quiet corridor where there was not a soul. Could she have gotten lost? The girl walked, feeling a little tense because the atmosphere of the huge and quiet corridor was making her nervous. At that very moment, the girl heard strange rustling and groans behind her. Not understanding what was happening, she continued walking, but at that moment she tripped and ended up leaning on the chest of drawers, activating a mechanism unknown to her. A moment later, the wall in front of her parted, and our heroine saw a strange descent downwards. This staircase looked rather gloomy, so Estelle wondered whether it was worth checking what was below. Somehow she understood for herself that that strange sound seemed to come from here. However, at that moment, someone started shouting in confusion and asking who was walking there. The shouts were getting closer with every millisecond. It was a knight who ran towards the girl, saying that no one was allowed to enter the residence of the crown prince, so he asked the thief to show himself. Estelle faced a choice. What should she do? Should she run away or go to the prince's room? The girl understood that given the distance she would soon be caught, which meant she needed to act quickly. However, at that moment, Baron Jean appeared behind the knight and told the guard that he had done a good job. The knight turned around in surprise and said that he had heard something strange. Jean in turn said that his shift was already over. Did he really have something urgent? The boy said that he saw a suspicious shadow on the way to the crown prince's room. At that moment, our heroine looked at her hands and realized that magic had been used on her, or maybe she imagined it. Anyway, looking out from around the corner, the girl assumed that Jean had helped her. In any case, the girl decided that she should take advantage of this opportunity. She began to run quickly from this place, which of course was noticed by Baron Lambert. Soon the action shifts back to the Valois estate. Lloyd, perplexed, asks the girl to repeat what she just said. He decided to repeat her words, asking if the crown prince really knew about her aunt's whereabouts. The girl stood in the middle of the room and said that judging by the man's reaction, everything was exactly like that. The second duke told the girl that there had long been rumors that the crown prince was partial to the dragon's tear. Unlike the current emperor who strives for a relatively peaceful situation, the crown prince is simply power-hungry. However, that was not all the news from Estelle. The girl said that she found something similar to a dungeon in the prince's palace where she heard the sound of a beast crying. The girl said that the creature seemed to ask her to save him. Lloyd stood up from his chair in confusion and asked if it was true. Our heroine told him that in any case she felt that His Highness the Crown Prince was hiding something from them, but she couldn't ask him directly. In that case, Lloyd said she could ask His Majesty. Estelle, perplexed, asked how she dared to address him. Moreover, the girl asked if he was by any chance lying in a hospital bed and not receiving guests. The second duke said that 5 years had already passed, but he could not miss the hunting festival which was held once a year. Our heroine immediately remembered that this was the very famous event of the Astrid Empire, the hunting festival. Count Brienne, who was a complete zero in sports, was also somehow present every year due to the fact that the imperial and major families were required to attend. Estelle looked at Lloyd at that moment and asked if she could participate. The girl said that she would like to participate in the festival and personally ask questions to His Majesty. The action shifts to the next morning. At that moment, a huge magical force flew at the targets, knocking everyone off their feet. While our heroine looked in bewilderment at everything she had done, Alun stood behind her and supported her, saying that she was doing well. The girl turned around and said that she was doing much better than she thought. Mr. Allen told her that this only meant that she had become stronger and that a tool like this was affected by the owner's abilities. The guy added that when he heard that she was going to participate in the hunting festival, he honestly wanted to dissuade her. But he couldn't do anything about it because that was her will, which meant he had no right to change it. Although it was still sad that on the eve of the holiday, she would be accompanied not by him, but by Ennard. Our heroine laughed and told him not to be upset because he would still be able to accompany her to other events. At that moment, someone called Mrs. Estelle. One of the maids happily told the girl that Madame Camille had arrived to see her. The girl asked where she was, to which the maid said that she was waiting for her in the garden. Estelle happily said that she was already running to her.